You've found the Stealth Podcast. Where are you watching from? What time is it there? Subscribe and comment to support us. Thanks. Let's begin. My name is Garrett Hollis. I'm 34 years old, and I live out of a converted 2008 Ford E350 I call the box. Not because it's clever, but because that's exactly what it is. A box on wheels. I've been doing this for about 2 years now, bouncing between states, picking up contract electrical work wherever someone needs me. It's not glamorous, but it's mine. The plan for this particular stretch was simple. I just wrapped a 3-week job in Casper, rewiring an old ranch property outside of town, and I had about 5 days before my next gig started in Idaho Falls. My buddy Trace Mullen, 31, had been riding with me for the last 2 weeks. He wasn't a van person by nature. He was a couch person, a comfortable bed person, a where's the nearest Applebee's person. But he'd just gone through a bad breakup and needed out of Denver, so I told him to grab a bag and stop overthinking it. He showed up with 2 bags, a neck pillow, and a portable espresso maker, which told me everything I needed to know about how prepared he actually was for this. We also had Dre Voss with us, 38, a freelance photographer who I'd met at a rest stop outside of Cheyenne about 4 days earlier. That sounds stranger than it was. She'd been shooting landscapes across the state for a magazine feature, and her rental car had a flat with no spare. I had a plug kit. One thing led to another, and she ended up tagging along, sleeping in a tent she set up wherever we parked. She was quiet in the best way, the kind of person who observes more than she talks, who notices things other people walk right past. I liked that about her. Trace liked that she was pretty, which he was not subtle about, which she ignored completely. The spot I'd picked was off a Forest Service road about 12 miles northeast of KC, Wyoming, deep in the Powder River country, where the high plains start bleeding into broken badlands. I'd driven through that stretch once before, years ago, and remembered it being the kind of empty that feels almost rude. Like the land itself doesn't want to be looked at. No campgrounds, no facilities, no cell signal past the first 2 miles in. Just sage, creek rock, and sky, so wide it makes your chest hurt a little if you stare too long. The road in was rougher than I remembered. The box handled it fine. She's got enough clearance for most things, but Trace was gripping the dashboard like I was driving off a cliff. Dre was in the back, shooting through the rear window, which I'd asked her not to do while we were moving, which she had ignored. The late afternoon light was doing something strange out there. Not golden, not quite red, more like the sky had been stained with something old. It made the ridgelines look closer than they were and cast long, sharp shadows off every rock formation. We found a flat clearing near a dry creek bed around 6 p.m., maybe a quarter mile off the main track. Good sight lines in 3 directions, a low ridge to the west blocking the wind. I'd slept in worse spots, a lot worse. I killed the engine, and we all sat there for a second in that particular silence you only get when you're genuinely far from everything. No road hum, no distant highway, just wind in the sage and the tick of the cooling engine. Trace broke it first, obviously. So this is what you do for fun. He wasn't asking. Dre had already opened the back doors and was setting up her tent. What I noticed first, and I didn't say anything about it at the time, were the trees. There's a line of them following the dry creek, mostly cottonwoods and a few dead pines, and something about the way they were standing bothered me in a way I couldn't name. Not the trees themselves exactly, more like the space between them, like the gaps were placed wrong, or maybe it was the way the shadows fell through them. I've camped in 1,000 spots, and you develop a feel for a place fast, whether it sits right or it doesn't. This one didn't sit right. But the light was fading, I was tired, and I'd learned a long time ago not to let my brain invent problems before any actually show up. Dinner was canned chili heated on the propane burner, corn tortillas, and a beer each. Trace complained about the chili having too many beans. Dre ate quietly and looked at her photos from the drive-in. I noticed she kept stopping on one, zooming in, tilting the screen. I asked her what she was looking at. She said nothing and put her phone face down on her knee. The wind picked up around 8, rattling the sage in long, rolling waves, and the temperature dropped about 15 degrees in under an hour the way it does out there. Trace retreated inside the van. Dre zipped herself into her tent. I sat outside for another 20 minutes by myself, watching the dark settle in over the ridgeline. The tree line along the creek was maybe 60 yards out. By 9 o'clock, with the fire down to coals and only a half moon throwing any light, you could barely separate the standing trunks from the dark behind them. I had my headlamp, but I didn't use it. I just sat there, watching the way you do when you're not sure what you're watching for. At some point, I became aware that I'd been staring at the same gap between two cottonwoods for a long time. Not because anything moved, because nothing moved. Not the branches, not the sage around the base, not anything, while everything else around it shifted slightly in the wind. It was a stillness that didn't match. I told myself it was a rock formation or a trick of the shadows. I told myself that. I went inside, locked the doors, and lay there on my bunk for a long time before I fell asleep. I woke up at 2:14 a.m., and I know the exact time because I looked at my phone the second my eyes opened, the way you do when something pulls you out of sleep, but you don't know what. The van was cold. Not uncomfortable cold, just that sharp, dry cold that comes in through the floor panels when the temperature really drops. Trace was on the other bunk, breathing slow and steady, one arm hanging off the edge. I lay still for about a minute, listening. When it died down, that rolling sage sound was gone. What was left was nothing, a quiet, so complete it had a kind of weight to it, like pressure behind the ears. I needed to use the bathroom. That's the unglamorous reality of van life that nobody puts in their Instagram posts. 2 a.m., pitch black, middle of nowhere, and you have to go outside. I have a small camp toilet in the van, but I only use that as a last resort because cleaning it is miserable. I pulled on my boots without untying them, grabbed my headlamp off the shelf above my bunk, and opened the side doors slow and quiet as I could. The cold hit me immediately. Hard, clean, a little mean. I stepped out and pulled the door mostly shut behind me. The moon had shifted and was lower now, throwing longer shadows. The clearing looked different in the middle of the night, smaller somehow, like the edges had pulled in. I walked maybe 20 feet from the van toward the opposite side from Dree's tent, did what I had to do, and was turning back when my headlamp swept across the tree line. I stopped. I stood there with the light pointed at the cottonwoods for probably 4 or 5 seconds. There was something standing between two of the trunks. Not moving. Just there. My brain ran through the checklist fast. Rock, bush, shadow, fence post, and none of it fit. The shape had a vertical quality that was wrong for all of those. I clicked my headlamp off. Stood in the dark. Clicked it back on. The shape was gone. Here's the thing about that moment, and I've thought about it a lot since. I didn't feel a spike of panic. What I felt was slower than that. More like cold water rising around your ankles. I stood there another few seconds, scanning the tree line, and saw nothing. Wind pushed through, and everything moved the way it was supposed to. I went back to the van, got in, locked the door, and lay down. I didn't wake Trace. I told myself it was a deer, which was entirely plausible and also not what it looked like. I know what a deer looks like at night. I've seen hundreds of them. Whatever that shape was, it wasn't low and horizontal and light catching the way a deer is. It was upright, and it was still. I didn't sleep again. I lay on my back and stared at the ceiling of the van and listened to the nothing outside for the next 4 hours. Trace woke up around 6, sat up, scratched his head, and said, "I smell like a fire," before he'd even fully opened his eyes. I didn't tell him what I'd seen, not because I was protecting him, more because saying it out loud felt like it would make it real in a way I wasn't ready for yet. I needed daylight first. I needed to walk over to that tree line and find the obvious, boring explanation sitting right there in the dirt. A fence post, a dead trunk, a weird angle on a shadow. That's almost always what it is. Dree was already up when I stepped outside, camera in hand, walking the edge of the clearing in the early gray light. I watched her for a second before she noticed me. She was moving slowly, stopping every few steps, looking at the ground more than the horizon. When she saw me, she straightened up and waved, easy and relaxed, and I felt some of the tightness in my chest loosen a little. "Sleep okay?" she asked. I said, "Yeah, mostly." She tilted her head slightly. She had this way of doing that when she thought you were lying, not confrontational, just noting it. I asked her what she'd been looking at on the ground. She was quiet for a moment. "Probably nothing," she said, same as the night before. She said it the exact same way, and I noticed that. After breakfast, I walked to the tree line. I told Trace I was stretching my legs, and he didn't look up from his phone. He'd somehow found a sliver of signal and was burning through it like a man just released from prison. The ground between the van and the cottonwoods was a mix of dry creek silt and hardpan, scattered with small rocks. About halfway there, I found what Dree had been looking at. Footprints. Not mine, not Trace's, not Dree's. Bigger than any of ours, and barefoot, the toe impressions clear and deep in a soft patch of silt. They came from the direction of the tree line, moved toward the van to within about 30 feet, and then stopped. Just stopped. No turn. No trail leading back. Like whatever made them had simply ceased walking in the middle of an open field at night. I stood over those prints for a long time. The logical part of my brain was still working. Could be old, could be from before we arrived, could be some random person who camps here regularly. Barefoot though. Barefoot out here, on this ground, at whatever temperature the night hit. I took a picture of the prints with my phone and kept walking to the tree line. The cottonwoods were gnarled and close together in places, the ground between them choked with dry brush. I pushed in about 10 feet and stopped. It smelled wrong in there. Not rotten exactly, more like something mineral and cold, like wet stone, except there was no water anywhere near here. And the brush was pressed down in a rough circle about 6 feet across, like something had been sitting or standing in one place long enough to flatten it. The branches above the circle were broken in a very deliberate, downward-facing pattern, like something tall had pushed through from above. I went back to the van and told Dree what I'd found. I showed her the photo of the prints. She looked at it for a long time, then looked up at me, and I could see she was making a decision about how much to say. She pulled out her camera, scrolled back to the photo she'd been staring at the night before, and turned the screen toward me. It was a shot she'd taken through the rear window on the drive-in, the road behind us, the sage, the flat horizon. And at the far right edge of the frame, half hidden behind a rock formation, was a figure, upright, pale, watching the van as it drove past. She'd shot it from a moving vehicle at distance, so it was small and slightly blurred, but the shape was unmistakable. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head that was tilted at an angle that made something at the base of my skull go very quiet and very cold. Trace saw the photo at 9 a.m. and spent the next 20 minutes explaining to us why it was a surveying marker or a piece of farm equipment, and I let him do it because watching him convince himself was almost impressive. He had an answer for everything. The footprints were old, the flattened brush was deer. The shape in the photo was a fence post with a reflector cap. He was very committed. Dree and I didn't argue with him. We just watched him build his case and didn't say anything, which was probably crueler than arguing would have been. Eventually, he ran out of explanations and filled the silence by making coffee, which was his response to most things. The decision I was turning over was whether to leave. That's the honest version. I kept framing it as should we stay another night in my head, but what I was really asking was, is this bad enough to run from right now? The answer kept coming back inconclusive. Nothing had happened. We hadn't been approached, threatened, touched. What we had was a blurry photo, some footprints, and a weird smell in some bushes. If I called the Natrona County Sheriff's Office and described those things, the conversation would be short and not in my favor. So we stayed. We stayed, and I told myself it was a reasonable decision and not just stubbornness, though it was probably both. What changed the mood of that morning, and not in a good way, was what Trace found around 11. He'd wandered off toward the low ridge to the west, said he wanted to see what was on the other side, which was a very untraced thing to do, but I figured the open space was getting to him the way it gets to city people after a few days. He was gone maybe 40 minutes. When he came back, he was quieter than I'd seen him since Denver. He sat down on the van's rear bumper and took a while before he said anything. What he eventually said was, "There's a camp on the other side of that ridge. Not a van camp, not a hiker camp." He described a collection of objects arranged in a rough clearing. Old clothing folded into piles, several gallon jugs of water with the caps still on, what looked like food wrapped in cloth, and a fire ring with ash that was, according to Trace, still warm. Nobody had been visible. No tent, no vehicle, no person. Just the objects arranged with a neatness that Trace kept coming back to, like someone laid it all out on purpose, like a table setting. Dree immediately wanted to go look. I immediately didn't want her to. We compromised. All three of us went together mid-afternoon, and we'd be back at the van well before dark. That was the rule I set. Back before dark. The ridge was only about a quarter-mile out, and the walk was easy, dry grass and loose shale, the kind of terrain that turns your ankles if you're not paying attention. Trace led us to a fold in the ridgeline that dropped into a shallow bowl on the other side, sheltered from the wind, and there it was. It was more than Trace had described, or maybe seeing it in context made it more. The clothing piles were larger, not just folded shirts, but entire outfits, laid out flat on the ground the way you'd lay out clothes for a child before school. Shirt, pants, socks, shoes. 3 complete sets, which hit me in a particular way I didn't immediately analyze. 3 sets for 3 people. The water jugs were lined up with the handles all facing the same direction. The wrapped food turned out to be, when Dree crouched and carefully opened one without fully disturbing it, canned goods wrapped in cloth, tied with twine. Tuna, beans, peaches. The fire ring was small and clean, and the ash inside it was, as Trace had said, still faintly warm. Someone had been here that morning. Dree was photographing everything methodically, moving around the perimeter of the arrangement without stepping inside it. I watched her, and I watched the ridgeline. Trace was doing the thing where he talks to manage his nerves, quiet, fast commentary about how it was probably a hunter's cache, or maybe some kind of wilderness survival training setup, maybe a church group. I didn't say anything. I was doing the math on 3 sets of clothing for 3 people and not liking where the math went. Whoever set this up knew we were here, knew there were 3 of us, had been close enough to count. We left the bowl and got back to the van faster than we'd walked out there. Nobody said run, but nobody walked slowly either. I did a full loop around the van when we got back. Checked the tires, the door locks, looked underneath, checked that the rear doors were still secured from inside. Everything was as we'd left it. But the footprints in the silt were still there, and now in the afternoon light, I could see a second set I'd missed that morning, smaller, from a different direction, also barefoot, also stopping abruptly within range of the van. 2 people, at minimum, standing in the dark outside while we slept. The argument for leaving was now very loud. Trace was making it verbally, pacing around the van, his earlier rationalizations completely gone. He wanted to drive out, find a motel in Buffalo or Gillette, come back to this topic from 60 miles away in a locked room. I almost agreed. What stopped me was timing. It was already past 4. The Forest Service road in the dark with no cell signal was its own risk, and leaving in a panic meant not thinking clearly about the drive out. I told them we'd leave at first light, packed and moving by 6. I believe that was the smart call. Looking back, smart had very little to do with what that night required. I spent the early evening rearranging the inside of the van, moved our bags to create a clear path from the bunks to the driver's seat, made sure the keys were on the hook right by my head, checked the fuel. Dree broke down her tent and put everything inside the van, which she did without me asking and without comment. Trace sat in the passenger seat for most of the evening facing forward, watching the road back out, which wasn't a bad idea. I cooked pasta with olive oil and garlic because doing something normal with your hands helps, and we ate inside the van with the doors locked and the windows cracked just enough for the steam to escape. After dark, the wind came back, different from the night before. Less rolling, more directional, pushing hard from the northwest and making the van rock slightly on its suspension. It covered sound in a way I didn't like. I sat up reading until about midnight, then killed the light and lay there. Trace was asleep within 20 minutes, which told me either he was genuinely comfortable or he'd completely dissociated from the situation. Dree was on the floor in her sleeping bag. She'd insisted, said she slept better flat, and I could tell from her breathing she wasn't out either. At some point, she said quietly, in the dark, the figure in my photo, the head angle. She paused. Animals don't hold their heads like that. I didn't answer. There wasn't anything useful to say. I just lay there and listened to the wind and watched the ceiling and waited for morning with the patience of a man who wasn't sure morning was going to settle anything. At 3 a.m., something hit the roof of the van. Not wind, not a branch. There were no branches anywhere near us. A single impact, heavy and deliberate, somewhere above the rear sleeping area. The sound was a dense, flat thud, the kind that means wait, and it brought all three of us upright at exactly the same moment. Nobody spoke. The van rocked very slightly, once then settled. I had the keys in my hand before I was fully aware of reaching for them. Trace had his back against the wall between the bunks, both feet on the floor. Dree had her hand on my arm. We sat in that silence for what felt like a very long time. Nothing followed the impact. No scratching, no movement across the roof, no second hit. Just the wind and then nothing. I was running through architecture in my head. The roof of the van is sheet metal, maybe 8 feet up from the ground on the outside. You don't end up on it accidentally. You either climb up or you come down from somewhere, and there was nowhere to come down from in the middle of a flat clearing. Trey started to say something, and I put my hand up, and he stopped. I sat, and I listened, and I did not move for 5 full minutes. Then something moved along the driver's side of the van. Not a hit or a bang, movement. The particular sound of something brushing against sheet metal slowly from front to back. I've heard animals do this. Bears will lean against a vehicle. Deer will brush past. The pressure and pace of this was different. It was measured. It was at standing height. It went all the way from the front wheel well to the rear corner of the van and then stopped. I was looking at Trace when it happened, and I watched his face go completely flat, which was more unsettling than if he'd looked panicked. Dree moved first. She reached up in the dark, found her camera, and turned the screen toward the window. Not to shoot, to use the screen as a faint light source to see my face. I shook my head at her. She nodded and put it down. I am not a person who panics easily. I've been in some genuinely bad situations over the years, a gas explosion on a job site, a rollover on an icy highway outside Laramie. And what I know about myself is that I go quiet and functional when things get bad. So I was functional. I was thinking about the doors, all locked. I checked twice. The windows, all closed and latched. The ignition key was in my hand. What I wasn't thinking about clearly was the roof vent, which was cracked about 2 inches for airflow, and which I had not latched before bed. The sound from the roof came back. Not an impact this time, but a slow movement directly above where I was lying. Back and forth, maybe 18 inches of travel, like someone shifting their weight. I could hear the metal flex very slightly. Not a sound a van makes on its own. Not wind, not thermal expansion, not settling. Someone was on the roof of my van at 3 in the morning in a dry creek bed 12 miles from the nearest paved road, moving back and forth, and I was lying directly below them, separated by about 4 inches of sheet metal. That a thought that does something to you. I noticed I was gripping the keys hard enough that the teeth were digging into my palm. I made a decision. I leaned over to Trace and put my mouth close to his ear and told him, barely above a breath, that when I said go, he needed to get into the passenger seat and keep his head down. I told Dree the same. She'd already figured it out. I moved to the driver's seat in the dark, slow and deliberate. Every movement calculated to not rock the van. Settled in, slid the key toward the ignition without inserting it yet. I wanted to know where all the variables were before I made noise. Because starting the engine was going to be loud, and it was going to tell whoever was out there on the roof, beside the van, wherever else they might be, exactly what we were doing. I looked in the driver's side mirror. There was enough moonlight to see a rough patch of ground behind the van. Somebody was standing there, roughly 8 or 10 feet back, directly behind the rear bumper, completely still. The moonlight gave me shape but not detail. Tall, thin, arms at sides, head turned at an angle toward the driver's mirror. Toward me. I don't know if they could see me in the mirror or if they were just looking at the van, but the angle of the head, that same angle from Dree's photo, made every hair on the back of my neck respond at once. I turned the key. The engine cranked for one horrible long second before it caught. Cold engine, cold night, and the longest single second of my life. And then it was running, loud and rough and real, and I had the headlights on and I was moving before I consciously decided to move. The figure behind the van was suddenly lit by the reverse lights, and I saw it clearly for the first time. It didn't run. It didn't flinch. It just stood there in the white light, watching us, and I had enough time to see, before I wrenched the wheel and accelerated forward, that the feet were bare. Both of them, pale as chalk against the dark ground. There was a sound from a roof as I accelerated, a rolling, dragging sound, like something scrambling for purchase and losing it. And then a heavy impact somewhere behind us that I felt more than heard. And then we were moving through the clearing toward the track, and I had the headlights cutting through the sage, and I was driving too fast for the terrain, and I didn't care. Trace was pressed against the dashboard with both hands flat on the glove box. Dree was in the back, one hand on my seat back, saying nothing. The Forest Service track was rough, and I was taking it twice the safe speed, and the van was bucking and slamming, and I kept going. We made the paved road in 11 minutes. I know because I looked at the clock when we hit asphalt, and it said 3:26, and I checked it just after the first impact at 3:02. 11 minutes on that road felt like being run through something. When I felt pavement under the tires, I didn't stop. I turned onto the highway and drove toward KC, and nobody said a word for the first 10 miles. Trace was the one who finally broke. He said, very quietly, there was more than one. When you turned the headlights on, I saw. On the left side of the clearing, near the sage, there were two more. Just standing there. He stopped, swallowed. They were all looking at the van. We made it to KC by 4 a.m., and I pulled into the parking lot of a closed gas station on Main Street and just sat there with the engine running for a while. The overhead fluorescents above the pump canopy were on, which felt important. That particular kind of ugly, flat light that means civilization, that means other people exist. Trace got out and stood under the lights with his arms crossed and didn't say anything. Dree stayed in the van, and I could hear her going through her camera, reviewing images, the soft click of the scroll wheel. I called the Johnson County Sheriff's Office at 4:22 a.m. I explained what I could, where we'd been parked, what we'd found at the camp over the ridge, the footprints, the figures. The dispatcher was professional and calm. She told me a deputy would be in touch in the morning and that without evidence of a direct threat or injury, it would be classified as a suspicious persons report. I understood that. It's a big county, and 3 campers spooked in the middle of the night is not their most urgent call. I gave her the GPS coordinates I'd saved from when we'd arrived. She took them. What I spent the next hour thinking about, while Trace went inside a diner that opened at 5 and Dree sat quietly in the passenger seat, was the thing I hadn't said to anyone yet. When we drove out, when I hit the accelerator and the headlights came on, and I saw the figures standing behind the van in the reverse lights. In that moment, right before I looked away, I had a clear look at the face. Not detailed, not long. A second, maybe less, but enough. The expression wasn't what I expected. It wasn't rage or blankness. It looked patient, like something that wasn't in a hurry, like something that understood that a locked van on a dirt road is not a permanent solution. Dree had the photo up on her camera screen when I got back in the van. Not the one from the drive-in. A new one. She'd taken it through the van window when I turned the headlights on, before we accelerated in the fraction of a second while the clearing was fully lit. There were 4 of them. Not 3, not 2. For figures standing in a loose arrangement around the van, different distances, different directions, all facing it. The one behind the van was closest. The others were further out, half inside the tree line, half in the open. She hadn't captured their faces in any detail. Too dark, too fast, slight motion blur. But you could see what Trace had said. They were all oriented toward the van. And you could see something else. They were not dressed. Not in the modern sense. Not in any sense. Whatever was covering some of them looked old. Wrapped, not worn. A deputy named Briscoe reached us by phone around 8 that morning. He was a direct, unhurried man who didn't try to explain away what we described. He said there'd been 2 other reports from that area in the past 14 months, both involving campers, both involving figures observed at night, both unresolved. He said the area around that stretch of Powder River country had a complicated history that he wasn't going to get into over the phone, but that it would be worth my time to look into. He told us not to go back. He said it with the tone of someone giving advice they expect to be ignored, and I made sure he knew we weren't ignoring it. We drove to Buffalo that morning and checked into a motel. Trace took a 2-hour shower and came out looking like a person again. Dree uploaded all her images to her laptop and went through them for 3 hours at the small table by the window, making a folder she didn't show me. I slept for 6 hours and woke up feeling not rested but functional. The three of us ate dinner at a steakhouse on Main Street that night and talked about everything except what had happened, which was its own kind of processing. Trace ordered pie. Dree wrote something in a small notebook she kept in her jacket pocket. I ate and watched the street outside. What Deputy Briscoe had said about the area's history sent me to the motel's terrible Wi-Fi and an hour of reading that I'm not going to summarize because most of it is disputed and I don't want to present speculation as fact. What I'll say is that the Powder River Basin has a long, layered history, indigenous, colonial, industrial, and that some of the land out in those breaks has never really been mapped, and that there are accounts going back a long way of people encountering things in that country that don't fit comfortable categories. I don't know what we encountered. I know what I saw and what the photo shows and what the footprints looked like and what I felt when I looked at that face in the reverse lights. I put almost 300 miles between us and KC the next morning. Trace was back on his phone by mid-morning, back to his normal volume, back to complaining about road noise and gas station coffee. I was glad. Dree asked me at a fuel stop in Shoshone if I planned to go back someday, and I thought about it for a real moment before I answered. I told her no. She nodded like she'd expected that. She sent me a copy of the photo, the one with 4 figures in the lit clearing, a week later with no message attached, just a file. I keep it on my phone. I've looked at it many times, probably too many, trying to find the conventional explanation that turns 4 upright, watching, barefooted figures standing in a circle around a van at 3 a.m. into something manageable, into something that fits. I haven't found it. I've driven through Wyoming twice more since then on work, and both times I've taken I-25 straight through without stopping, windows up, not looking too hard at the breaks and the ridgelines where the land folds away into dark, and the sage goes on forever, and there's nothing standing between you and whatever decides to stand there. Some spaces aren't empty because nothing lives there. Some spaces are empty because everything in them has learned to be very, very still. My name is Sylvia Crane. I'm 47 years old, and I live in Laramie, Wyoming, or I did before the divorce made the house feel like a mouth I didn't want to be inside anymore. 6 months ago, I bought a used Winnebago Mini from a retired couple in Cheyenne who'd used it exactly 4 times and kept it in showroom condition. I named it nothing. It didn't need a name. It needed gas and an oil change and a reason to move, and I had all 3. I wasn't doing the romantic version of Vanlife. No string lights, no reclaimed wood shelving, no Instagram handle. I was doing the version where you're 47 and your marriage of 19 years just dissolve and your kids are grown and gone, and you need to be somewhere that isn't anywhere you've already been. My daughter Petra, 24, had taken 2 weeks off from her job at a landscape architecture firm in Fort Collins to come with me for the first stretch. She hadn't asked. She just showed up at my door with a bag and said she wasn't letting me drive into the wilderness alone, and I didn't argue because I didn't actually want to be alone. I just didn't know how to ask. Petra brought her boyfriend, Calo Reyes, 27, a soft-spoken civil engineering grad student with good instincts and the useful habit of checking things twice. Locks, maps, tire pressure. I liked him immediately and told Petra so, which embarrassed her and pleased her in equal measure. The 3 of us left Laramie on a Tuesday in late September. No fixed itinerary, just a general agreement to head northwest and stop when something looked right. Wyoming northwest means you're heading into serious country fast. The Wind River Range, the Owl Creek Mountains, the high basin land that sits between ranges and belongs to nothing in particular. The place I found on the 3rd day was Boysen Reservoir in the Wind River Canyon country south of Thermopolis. I'd driven past the canyon once years ago and never stopped, which is the kind of thing you regret properly only when you finally do stop. The canyon is something else. The Wind River cuts through Owl Creek Mountain in a gap that shouldn't be geologically possible. Sheer walls of Precambrian rock going straight up 600 feet on both sides. The road and the river running side by side through the bottom. It makes you feel genuinely small in a way that's almost pleasant if you're in the right frame of mind. Boysen Reservoir sits at the south end of the canyon where the walls open up and the river spreads into a long, flat body of water surrounded by high desert and distant ridgelines. There's a state park there with campgrounds, but we pulled past the main sites and found a dispersed camping area on the west bank that was nearly empty. A Tuesday in late September means most of the summer crowd is long gone. We found a pull-through site about 30 yards from the waterline, level ground, good view across the reservoir. The water was that particular gray-green it gets when the sky is overcast, and the far bank was maybe half a mile out, low and brown and still. Callow set up the camp chairs while Petra and I made the inside of the Winnebago functional. She had a system, very precise, everything in a specific place, which I recognized as my own organizing habit and found touching in the way that seeing yourself and your children always is. We cooked actual food that first night, the three of us around the small table. A proper meal, not camp food, chicken thighs and roasted vegetables because Petra had insisted on bringing a cast iron pan. We ate and talked the way you do when tension is slowly leaving your body, when you're starting to believe the trip was a good idea. What I noticed that evening was the quiet at the water's edge. Not peaceful quiet, a different quality. The reservoir had almost no bird activity, which struck me as strange because that kind of water usually pulls birds in numbers. No ducks, no herons, nothing working the shallows. The surface was very still despite a light breeze that should have put some chop on it. I walked down to the waterline after dinner while Petra and Callow cleaned up and stood there watching the surface. The stillness had a quality I couldn't immediately name, not calm, exactly, but held. Like the water was doing something other than just sitting there. There was a camp about 200 yards south of us along the bank. A single vehicle, a dark-colored truck with an older camper shell that had been there when we arrived and whose occupant we hadn't seen. No fire, no chairs outside, no movement around it at all. I'd assumed whoever it was had gone fishing or hiking and come back after dark, but the truck hadn't moved and there were no lights. Callow had mentioned it at dinner, and I'd said it was probably a solo traveler who kept to themselves. That's common enough. Nothing about it required a second thought. I went to bed at 10 and lay there reading for an hour. Petra and Callow were already asleep in the convertible dinette that pulled into a double bed. I'd taken the rear bedroom, which had a small window facing the reservoir. I turned off my reading light and looked out the window at the water. The overcast had thinned and there was pale moonlight on the surface now. The reservoir looked wider at night, the far bank almost invisible. And the truck 200 yards south was still dark, still motionless, but I could see now that the camper shell's rear window was open, the small pane pushed out at an angle. And something about that, the open window and the darkness inside and the complete stillness of everything around it, made me pull my own window's curtain closed before I went to sleep. The sound that woke me wasn't loud. It was the specific sound of water moving against the bank, a rhythmic lapping that's usually pleasant, the kind of thing you pay extra for on a sound machine. Except it was coming from the wrong direction. The water line was east of US toward my window. This sound was coming from the west side of the Winnebago, the land side, the road side, where there was nothing but gravel and sage and 40 feet of empty space before the access road. I lay still and listened. The sound wasn't continuous. It came in short sequences, 3 or 4 laps, then silence, then again. Not like water and wind, which has an organic irregularity to it. This was measured. I got up and moved to the window on the roadside, the small frosted one above the storage cabinet, and cracked the curtain. Nothing. Gravel, sage, pale moonlight. The access road was empty. The sound had stopped. I went back to bed and lay there for a long time. Around 2 a.m., I heard Callow get up. He had a weak bladder, which Petra had warned me about in the kind of matter-of-fact way couples discuss each other's minor flaws after enough time together. I heard him use the bathroom at the front of the Winnebago and then heard him stop on his way back. Just stop. Stand still. I waited. After maybe 30 seconds, he came to the bedroom doorway and said my name softly. I said I was awake. He came in and crouched by the bed and said, low and even, "There's someone standing by the water." I went to the rear window and looked. There was a figure at the waterline, maybe 60 feet from the Winnebago, standing with their back to us, facing the reservoir, completely still. The moonlight was good enough to see the outline clearly. A person standing in what looked like wet clothing, dark from the waist down, just standing at the edge of the water doing nothing. Not fishing, not looking at a phone, not moving in any way, just standing there in the middle of the night facing a reservoir. Callow and I watched for almost 4 minutes. The figure did not move once. I know the normal explanation is a person who couldn't sleep and wanted to look at the water, because that's a completely human thing to do, and if I'd seen it 8 in the evening, I wouldn't have given it a second thought. It was the stillness. Normal people fidget. They shift their weight, scratch their arm, turn their head. This figure had the quality of something that had been placed there. Callow said, very quietly, "I don't think that came from the truck." I looked south toward the dark camper. Same position, same darkness. Then I looked back at the figure at the waterline and realized the figure was between us and the truck, which meant it had come from north, from the direction of the main campground, or from the water itself. We didn't wake Petra. That was a decision we made independently and simultaneously. Just looked at each other in the low light and agreed, without words, that waking her would escalate something that might resolve itself. I'm not proud of this reasoning, but it's what we did. I watched the figure until nearly 3 a.m. and then it was gone. Not suddenly, I didn't see it leave. One moment it was there, and the next time I looked it wasn't. The water behind where it had been standing was slightly disturbed, which could have been wind, could have been a figure wading in, could have been nothing. Morning was gray and cold. A thin cloud cover, turning the reservoir the color of old pewter. Petra made coffee and was bright and functional in that way young people can be in the morning that I have always mildly resented. I told her over coffee what Callow and I had seen. She listened carefully, both hands around her mug, and when I finished she said, "How wet were their clothes?" Which was exactly the right question and not the one I'd expected. I told her they looked dark from the waist down, like someone who'd been waiting. She nodded slowly and looked out the window at the waterline. After breakfast, Callow walked south to the truck. I watched him from the camp chair, one eye on Petra, who was shooting the canyon walls with her phone. He got to the truck and stood beside it for a moment, then came back. He said the truck was a late 90s Ford F-250. The camper shell was old and faded, and there was nobody in it. The rear camper door was not padlocked, just pulled closed. He hadn't opened it. He said the ground around the truck was muddy near the water's edge, and there were tracks in the mud. He'd photographed them. He showed me on his phone, boot prints going toward the water. No prints coming back. I walked down to the waterline myself, to the spot where the figure had been standing. The bank, there was a mixture of gravel and fine silt, and the silt held impressions. There was a clear zone of disruption. Not a single print, but a compression pattern, like something had stood in that area long enough to settle into the ground. And at the water's edge, in the wet margin, there were marks going in. Not out, just in, like someone had walked into the reservoir and not come back out. I went back to the Winnebago and looked up the Boysen Reservoir State Park on my phone. Standard results: fishing, boating, camping. Then I searched more specifically. It took about 10 minutes of reading before I found it, buried in a local news archive from about 8 years back. A drowning at Boysen Reservoir, a man in his 50s, ruled accidental. Body recovered 3 days after disappearance, found in the southern arm of the reservoir. What the article mentioned briefly, in a way that clearly wasn't meant to be the story's focus, was that 2 other campers at the site had reported seeing a figure standing at the water's edge the night before the body was found. Standing still, in the dark. Petra wanted to stay. I want to be clear about that. It was my daughter, 24 years old, who read the article over my shoulder and said that could be a coincidence and meant it, and who pointed out that we'd paid for 3 nights and that the weather window was closing and that one figure standing at a reservoir at 2 a.m. was not in itself a reason to pack up. Callow was quieter about it, but I could see he agreed with her. So I did what mothers do. I swallowed my instinct, which was large and loud and saying leave, and I let them vote. We stayed. What I did instead of leaving was adjust. I moved the Winnebago 20 feet closer to the access road, repositioned so the main door faced away from the water, and spent the morning reorganizing with the kind of focused attention I use when I'm managing anxiety. Petra and Callow hiked up the canyon wall trail, and were gone for 3 hours. I stayed at camp because I wanted to watch the truck. Nothing happened to the truck. Nothing happened to anything. The reservoir sat gray and still, and the sky did its thing, and a single hawk worked the thermals above the west rim for about an hour. Around midday, a park ranger came through on the access road in a white pickup, doing a routine check of the dispersed sites, nodding at me as he rolled past. I flagged him down. His name was on his shirt pocket, and it was Hester, which is a name I'd only ever seen on women, but it suited him fine. He was mid-50s, weathered in the way of men who work outside in Wyoming their entire lives. I told him about the figure at the waterline and the boot prints going into the water and the dark truck with no one in it. He listened with his arm on the door of his truck, and when I finished he asked how long the other vehicle had been there. I said since before we arrived, which was yesterday afternoon. He drove down to the truck. I watched from a distance. He spent about 5 minutes there, walked to the waterline, then drove back to me. He said the truck was registered to a man named Garl Seaton, 58, a Wyoming resident who'd had a camping permit for that site going back several years. He said he was going to run the registration and make some calls. He said it in a way that didn't invite follow-up questions, which answered one question and opened several others. He drove out. I stood there and looked at the truck for a long time. Petra and Callow came back from the hike flushed and happy. Petra with about 300 photos on her phone and Callow with a scratch on his forearm from a scramble he was trying not to make a big deal of. I told them about the ranger. Petra's mood shifted, not dramatically, but I know my daughter. She went quieter, the way she does when she's recalibrating. Callow looked at the truck. We ate lunch inside the Winnebago with the door closed, and the subject of leaving came up again, this time from Petra, and this time I let it sit on the table without picking it up immediately. What settled it? What made us stay one more night, which in retrospect I circle back to as the decision that mattered, was that Ranger Hester came back at 4 p.m. He parked and came to our door and told us that Garl Seaton had not been in contact with his family since arriving at Boise 4 days ago. The family had already filed a concern report and that a search was being initiated the following morning. He said we weren't being asked to leave, but that we should be aware of the situation and that if we saw or heard anything to call the park number. He gave me a card. He looked at the water for a moment when he said it, which I noticed. Then he left. That evening the wind came up off the reservoir and brought the temperature down hard. We ate inside, the three of us close together at the table, and the conversation was different from the first night, quieter, more deliberate, longer pauses. Callow showed us an elevation map of the reservoir on his laptop and pointed out that the southern arm was the deepest section, which was also where the drowning victim from 8 years ago had been found. He'd done the research quietly, on his own, and was presenting it the way engineers present things. Here is the data. Here is what it may mean. Petra looked at the map for a long time. She said, the truck is parked right above that section. After dark, I didn't even try to sleep early. I sat in the front cab seat with a cup of tea and watched the water line through the windshield. The cloud cover had cleared and the moon was up, and the reservoir surface held the light in a way that was almost pretty, that almost made you forget what you'd found in the mud. At 11 p.m., the surface near the bank began to change, a gentle disturbance, maybe 30 feet out, like something large moving slowly below the surface. Not fish. The scale was wrong. A long, slow push of water that traveled parallel to the bank from south to north, about 20 feet of displacement, and then stilled. Petra had come up front and seen it with me. Neither of us said anything. We watched the water return to flat and held that flatness. Then she put her hand on my arm and pointed, not at the water, at the bank. The figure was back. Same spot, same posture, back to us. Wet to the waist, standing absolutely still at the edge of the water in the moonlight. Except this time, as we watched, it turned around, slowly. The way you turn when you already know what's behind you and you're not in any hurry. The face was wrong. I'll say it straight. From the distance we were at, 30 feet, moonlight, details shouldn't have been that clear. But they were. The face was wrong the way a reflection is wrong. Recognizably human in structure, but something off in the proportions, in the expression, in the quality of the skin, which was pale and flat in a way that had nothing to do with the light. It stood and faced the Winnebago, and it did not do anything else. Petra's hand on my arm had gripped down hard, and she hadn't moved. Callow was awake. I heard him behind us, standing in the small gap between the cab seats, looking over our heads. He said nothing. The three of us sat and stood in the dark cab, and looked at this thing that was looking back at us from the waterline, and the only sound was the faint push of water against the bank and the low whistle of wind under the Winnebago's chassis. I was aware of every sound the vehicle was making, the refrigerator compressor cycling, the creak of my seat, Petra's controlled breathing. What happened next happened in a very short amount of time, but I've reconstructed it slowly many times since. The figure turned back toward the water. It walked in, not stumbling, not slipping on the bank, just walking as if water was a surface as reliable as ground. It went into its knees, its waist, without any change in its posture or pace. At chest depth it paused, and then it went under. Smoothly, completely, like a weighted object. The surface closed over it in a single motion, and the water went perfectly flat almost immediately, the way reservoir water does when it's deep. It was there, and then it wasn't, and the night carried on as if nothing had happened. I started the Winnebago. That was my response. Not a discussion, not a plan, just I started the engine. Petra said, "Mom," and I said, "I know," and she didn't say anything else. Callow was already moving to clear the entrance. Our folding step, the door cable, things that needed to be released before we could move. I did not have a rational framework for what I just watched. I had a running engine and a clear road, and I used them. We pulled out of the site in under 4 minutes, and I drove north on the Canyon Highway with the high beams on and did not stop until we reached Thermopolis, 18 miles up the road, where the lights of the town sat in the basin like something I wanted to put my arms around. We checked into the Days Inn on the main road at 12:40 a.m. Petra sat on the bed in our room and held her own elbows and stared at the middle distance for a while. Callow got ice from a machine down the hall and poured 3 glasses of water, which nobody drank. I called the park number ranger Hester had given me and left a message describing what we'd seen, the figure, the face, the entry into the water. I said it as plainly as I could, without editorializing, just the events in order. I left my number. I don't know what I expected them to do with it. What I kept coming back to, lying in the motel bed while Petra and Callow slept, was the face, the specific wrongness of it. I have a reference for wrongness. I once saw a car accident years ago on I-80 where a man had been thrown through a windshield and was alive, but his face had been restructured by the glass and the ground in a way that your brain registers as fundamentally wrong before you've had time to process what you're seeing. This was a different wrongness, not injury, something more like duration, like a face that had been held in cold water for a long time. I don't know how to be more precise than that, and I've tried. Ranger Hester called at 7:15 in the morning. I was already awake. He said the search team had gone out at first light and found Garl Seaton. I asked where. He paused for a moment and then said they'd found him on the bank, approximately where I had described seeing the figure standing. He said it with care, with the considered language of a man who'd had to report bad things before. I asked how long. He said the medical examiner would determine that, but that given the water temperature and other factors, it appeared to have been several days. He said, and this is the part I've thought about many times, that Mr. Seaton was standing up when they found him, not lying on the bank, standing at the water line, facing the water. He said the team had approached before realizing he was not alive. I sat with that for a long time. I'm still sitting with it. I don't have a clean explanation, and I'm not going to build one out of pieces that don't fit. What I know is that Garl Seaton had been in that water for days, and that what we saw walked into that water in the middle of the night, and that when they found him, he was standing at the edge of it like he was about to go back in, or like he'd just come out. I don't know which direction he was facing. I didn't ask Hester, and he didn't say. The 3 of us drove back to Laramie that day. Didn't stop, didn't sightsee, just drove south on 20 through Shoshone and picked up 26 east through the basin. Petra sat in the passenger seat for most of it, and we talked, really talked, the way we hadn't since before the divorce proceedings started, about her dad, about the house, about what I was actually doing out here in a Winnebago with no plan. I cried a little, once, briefly, and she didn't make a big deal of it. Callow slept in the back for 2 hours and woke up asking about lunch with the uncomplicated appetite of someone who had processed the night and filed it somewhere functional. I will always be grateful to him for that. I still have the Winnebago. I want to say that first because some people assume I sold it, that the obvious ending to a story like this is that I walked away from all of it and went back to something safer. I didn't. The van didn't do anything wrong. It ran when I needed it to, got us out on a bad road in the middle of the night, and got us home. You don't blame the vehicle. What I did stop doing was parking near water. That sounds like a small thing until you look at a map of Wyoming and realize how much of this state is reservoir and river and lake. How much of the best and most obvious camping puts you right at the edge of something deep. I have a different set of criteria now. Elevation over water. Distance from a bank. A site I can exit in more than one direction. Callow, who came back out with me in the spring, made a checklist and printed it. He laminated it. He taped it to the cabinet above the passenger seat. I love that kid. The search into Garl Seaton's death was ruled accidental drowning, which is what those rulings usually are when there are no witnesses and no evidence of foul play. The detail about how he was found, standing at the waterline, appeared once in a brief local news item and wasn't referenced again. I read the item 3 times to make sure I'd understood it correctly. I had. A man found standing at the edge of water he had been dead in for approximately 4 days, facing the reservoir. The medical examiner's report, which I found referenced in a public record filing, noted severe saturation and exposure consistent with extended submersion. The position of the body was not addressed. Petra called me about 2 months after the trip. She said she'd been doing some reading. She didn't say why, or say it the way you say things you've been thinking about in private for a while, and that there are indigenous accounts from the Wind River country, from the eastern Shoshone and Arapaho peoples whose land that basin has been for a very long time, of water-associated figures. Not malevolent exactly, or not in the way Western horror frameworks would describe malevolent. More like occupying a role, performing a function. She said some accounts describe them as appearing before or after drownings, sometimes as the drowned themselves. She said this carefully, the way she says things she's not sure I'm ready to hear. I thought about the face, the duration in it, the patience. I thought about what it would mean if Garl Seaton, a man who had camped at Boysen for years who knew that water well, had walked into the reservoir alone 4 days before we arrived and had come back out again, or something wearing the shape of what he'd been had come back out, to stand at the edge and wait for something, or to warn someone. I genuinely don't know which, and I've made peace with not knowing. Some things don't resolve. Some things stand at the edge of what you can understand and face you, and you either stand there staring back until you've lost something, or you start the engine. The Winnebago is parked behind my apartment in Laramie. I go out in it most weekends. I've been to the Great Salt Lake Desert in Utah, to the Badlands east of Moorcroft, to a beautiful flat stretch of high country north of Pinedale, where I parked and read for 3 days and watched elk move through the sage in the evenings. I have not gone back to Boysen. I have not gone back to any reservoir in the Wind River Basin. I drive past the canyon turnoff, sometimes on the way north, and I look at the walls where they close over the river, and I think about what it holds. All of it. The geology, the history, the water that's been moving through that cut for longer than anything alive can imagine. The last thing I'll say is this. The night we left, when I turned the Winnebago around on that gravel access road and got us pointed north, I had to swing wide, and for a moment the headlights swept across the site we'd just left. The camp chairs were still there. The fire ring, the mat we put by the door. All of it lit up in the headlights for 1 second before I straightened the wheel. And at the waterline, behind all our abandoned things, the surface of the reservoir was doing something I hadn't seen it do in the 2 days we'd been there. It was moving, a slow, wide ripple spreading outward from the bank, the kind of displacement that means something large just went in or just came out. I kept driving. I have never once wished I'd stopped to check which one it was. My name is Bodie Warwick. I'm 52 years old, and I've been living out of a converted Chevy Express van for going on 3 years now, ever since I retired early from 26 years as a wildland firefighter out of Boise. People assume retirement from that job means you finally get to rest. What it actually means is that you wake up every morning and don't know what your body is for anymore. The van was my answer to that. Keep moving, keep useful, find the next thing. The next thing, this particular October, was volunteer trail restoration work in the Bighorn National Forest in north central Wyoming. I'd signed up through a wilderness conservation org I'd been doing seasonal work with for 2 years. They placed volunteers at remote sites across the West, covering gas and supplies in exchange for 10 to 14 days of physical work. My contact, there was a woman named Ora Finch, 44, their Northwestern Regional Coordinator, who I'd worked with twice before in Idaho and trusted completely. She was practical, direct, and had the specific competence of someone who'd spent years managing difficult people in difficult places. The third member of our group was Marcus Del Rey, 39, a former high school science teacher from Billings who'd left the classroom 2 years back and was, as he put it, figuring out the next chapter. He was new to the volunteer program and new to remote camping, which Ora had flagged to me in a message before we met him, asking me to keep an eye out. Marcus was tall, good-humored, and slightly too talkative when he was nervous, which turned out to be useful because it filled silences that would otherwise have been harder to sit in. He drove a small travel trailer towed behind a Tacoma. Ora had her own van, a long-wheelbase Transit, white, immaculate, organized with a precision that I recognized as professional-grade coping. The work site was in a stretch of the Bighorn backcountry south of Medicine Wheel, the ancient stone structure on the Medicine Wheel/Medicine Mountain National Historic Landmark that sits at just under 10,000 feet on a high limestone plateau. We weren't at the landmark itself. Our trail section was about 4 miles south, dropping off the plateau into a long drainage called Red Gulch that runs down toward the Bighorn Basin. The access was a Forest Service road that climbed hard for 6 miles before leveling into a series of high meadows. We parked in the largest of these, which was flat and open and had a fire ring from previous use. The work itself was straightforward. Erosion repair on a section of trail that had been badly damaged by snowmelt runoff the previous spring, requiring new drainage structures, rock placement, and about 200 meters of tread reconstruction. Physical, focused work that I knew how to do and that felt good in the way physical outdoor work always does when you've been without it. The first 3 days were clean. Good weather, steady progress. The three of us falling into an easy working rhythm. Marcus was a quick learner and worked hard and apologized for things that didn't require apology, which was his particular version of trying. What was unusual about the site from the start was the altitude and the quality of the light. At that elevation, in October, the light changes fast and strange. Golden for about 40 minutes at each end of the day, and in between it has a flatness to it, a high-altitude clarity that makes distances hard to read. The plateau above us was always visible, that long limestone rim sitting against the sky, and Medicine Wheel itself, though we couldn't see the actual structure from our drainage, had a presence I don't know how to describe clinically. Ora said it plainly on the second night. This place has weight. She didn't mean it as a complaint. She just meant it. The nearest thing to another person was a Crow tribal cultural monitor named Everett Plainfeather, 56, assigned by the Tribal Historic Preservation Office to observe any ground disturbance work near the landmark area. He drove up the Forest Service road every other morning in an old Bronco, checked our work site, exchanged a few words with Ora, drank coffee from a thermos he never offered to share, and drove back up. He was not unfriendly. He answered direct questions with direct answers, but he watched us with the particular attention of someone who is paid to notice things going wrong. I respected that. I understood the job. On the fourth day, Everett came down and didn't leave. He parked the Bronco at the edge of our meadow and sat in it for most of the afternoon. When Ora went over to ask if everything was okay, he said yes, but didn't elaborate. At dinner, he accepted an invitation to join us and ate a plate of Marcus's chili with a focused appreciation that suggested he hadn't eaten since morning. He told us he found something on the plateau that morning. He didn't say what, that he wanted to be closer to the lower site for a few days. Ora asked if it involved our work area. He said no. He said it with a certainty that I noticed because it came too fast, the way certain answers come when someone has already thought carefully about what they're going to say. That night, after Everett had gone to his Bronco to sleep, Marcus came to the door of my van and stood there with his hands in his jacket pockets. He waited for me to ask what he wanted, which I did. He said that on his way back from the portable toilet about an hour earlier, he heard something up on the plateau rim. Not an animal, not wind. He said it was a voice, or something close enough to a voice that the distinction might be technical. A sustained, low vocalization that traveled down the drainage and stopped. He said it lasted maybe 15 seconds. He said it had made him feel, and he struggled for the word before he found it, unmade. Like something had reached into a frequency he didn't know he was broadcasting on. I told him to get some sleep. I lay awake for 2 hours after that, listening to the plateau, and heard nothing, which was not, in the end, reassuring. Everett was up before anyone the next morning. I heard the Broncos' door at first light and got up to find him standing at the edge of the meadow looking up at the rim. I brought 2 cups of coffee and stood beside him. The rim was maybe 800 feet above us, a clean limestone edge against the early sky. There was nothing on it. I handed him a cup and he took it and drank, and after a while he said, "You know what that structure is for?" I said I knew the basic history. He said the basic history is the part that gets written down. He told me, and he told me like he was deciding to as he went, not like he'd prepared to. That medicine wheel is a site of ongoing ceremonial significance to multiple Plains nations that has been in continuous active use for at least 5 centuries, and that what that means practically is that it is not simply an old thing. It is a living site, something that still functions. He said that the land around it, including the drainage we were working in, has a set of protocols that most visitors never hear about, because most visitors aren't doing ground disturbance work 4 miles from the structure. He said some of those protocols involve staying inside after dark. He said it looking at his coffee cup. I said, "What happens to people who don't?" He drank. He said, "Usually nothing. Sometimes the thing that was already coming toward you gets there faster." I spent that morning thinking about that sentence. What it meant logically, what it meant practically. The thing already coming toward you. The framing implied something I didn't have the cultural context to fully interpret. Not a boogeyman, not a monster, something more structural. Like a process, like weather. I worked the trail section and thought about it and didn't reach a conclusion that helped me, which I noted and filed and kept working. Marcus had heard what Everett said to me. He'd come up behind us mid-conversation without either of us noticing. And by midday, he was operating at about 60%, which for Marcus meant he was quiet. The silence was more unsettling than his usual pace of speech. Aura had noticed too, and she managed it the way she managed everything, practically without making a scene of it. At lunch, she told us we'd adjust our schedule. All trail were done by 4 p.m., everyone back at camp by 4:30, no evening hikes, no solo walks after dark. Everett watched her say this and made a very small nod that wasn't exactly approval, but was something adjacent to it. The afternoon went well. Good progress on the drainage structures, the work physical and absorbing in the way I needed it to be. The sky was doing something extraordinary above the rim. High clouds moving fast from the northwest, the light shifting in long intervals, the limestone catching different temperatures of light as it changed. I kept looking up at the rim despite myself, not because anything was there, because of the quality of the nothing that was there, which is hard to articulate, but which felt by mid-afternoon like the nothing was aware of being observed. We were done by 3:45, back at camp by 4. I made dinner early, a big pot of rice and black beans with canned green chili, and the 4 of us ate in the early dusk with the fire going, which Aura had been cautious about given the forest conditions, but which Everett had said was fine. The high meadows were green enough, and fire was not the concern tonight. Marcus asked him what the concern tonight was. Everett refilled his bowl and said, "The sound you heard 2 nights ago. You'll hear it again. The important thing is that you don't answer it." Marcus put down his spoon. We all looked at Everett. He ate. Aura asked what answering meant. He said, "Any sound that goes up. Your voice, anything, even a door." I thought about starting the van engine, which makes a sound that goes out in all directions, and I didn't say anything. The fire cracked, and the wind moved through the high grass at the meadow's edge, and above us the rim was going dark with the rest of the sky, the limestone edge disappearing into a blue-black that deepened as we watched. Everett finished eating, washed his bowl with water from his Bronco, and got in his vehicle. Not to sleep. I could see the dim light of something, a phone or a small lamp, active inside. At 9 p.m., I heard the sound. It came down the drainage exactly as Marcus had described. Low, sustained, not quite a voice, but shaped like one. Not language, not an animal. Something that sat in the frequency range of a large human chest, but had a quality of space in it, of distance, like it was coming from higher up than the rim. It lasted about 20 seconds. My fire reflex from firefighting years kicked, and immediately, I went still, assessed, located. The sound was northwest, upper drainage, high. It was not close. It was also not as far as I wanted it to be. Marcus was looking at me from across the fire. Ora had her hands flat on her knees. Nobody made a sound. When it stopped, the silence it left was different from the silence before it. Fuller, somehow. Like the space the sound had occupied was still shaped by it. We sat in that for a long time. I looked at Everett's Bronco. The small light inside was still on. After maybe 10 minutes, Ora said quietly and practically, "Everyone inside their vehicles." Nobody argued. I put out the fire with dirt, thoroughly, the way you do when you mean it, and got in the van and locked the doors and sat in the driver's seat with the key in my hand and looked up at the rim through the windshield. Whatever had made that sound was up there, or had been up there, and in the dark I couldn't see the rim anymore, just the place in the sky where I knew it was. Morning came, and the plateau rim was clear and ordinary, and the sun came up behind it in long orange bands, and I sat in the van and watched it and felt, for about 20 minutes, like I'd overreacted. That's how mornings work after nights like that one. The daylight does a kind of administrative work on the previous night, filing the worst of it under manageable, at least temporarily. Everett came to my van at 7. He sat in the passenger seat and drank his own thermos coffee and told me what he'd found on the plateau the previous morning, the thing that had made him stay. He'd found objects, not archaeological, not ancient, recent, a series of items arranged along a specific route on the plateau, starting about a mile from the wheel and moving south toward our drainage. At intervals of roughly 40 feet, a bundle of cloth, a small pile of stones arranged in an outward-facing ring, what appear to be personal items, a watch, a wallet with identification still inside, a keychain. Personal effects, laid out on a specific line, facing downhill, facing toward our camp. I asked whose identification. He said a man named Pearl Acosta, 43, from Sheridan, whose vehicle was in the parking area at the trailhead 4 miles north and had been there, according to the sign-in log, which Everett had checked, for 11 days. He said he'd called the Forest Service and the Bighorn County Sheriff's Office, and that a search had been initiated yesterday. He said the search teams were working north of the wheel and hadn't come down to our drainage yet. He said he thought they should. He said he thought they'd find the trail of objects leading them here, and that he wanted to be present when they did. I told Ora. She pulled out her laptop and started writing up a detailed site report. Coordinates, dates, everything, with the focused efficiency of someone who has managed serious situations before and knows that documentation is the first useful thing you can do. Marcus, to his credit, didn't fall apart. He got quiet again, that particular operative quiet, and spent the morning being useful, checking drainage work, moving materials, keeping his hands busy. I recognize that. It's how competent people manage fear when there's still work to do. The search team arrived at our meadow at 2 p.m. 2 Bighorn County deputies and 3 Forest Service rangers, organized and professional, with a dog team. They spoke with Everett at length. He showed them photos of the object trail on the plateau, and then spent time at our campsite asking questions about what we'd seen and heard. One of the deputies, a young woman named Tessler, took notes with the careful attention of someone who isn't dismissing anything. I told her about the sound, about Everett's instruction not to answer it. She wrote it down. The dog team picked up a trail in the upper drainage, above our work site, and moved north toward the plateau. We watched them go up the slope through the afternoon light, the dogs working steady and focused, the handlers following their lead without hesitation. For they were out of sight above the tree line. By 5, with the light going, they hadn't come back down. Ora called Tessler's number and got voicemail. The meadow went quiet with the absence of the search team. Quieter than it had been before they arrived, like their presence had been holding something back, and now it wasn't. What I started noticing around dusk was the objects. Not new ones. The ones Everett had described on the plateau. I kept thinking about the spacing. 40 feet apart, leading downhill, facing our camp. The watch, the wallet, the keychain. Personal effects. The word that kept surfacing was breadcrumbs, which isn't right, which doesn't capture what the arrangement felt like. More like a trail that wasn't for the person leaving it. more like a line drawn for something else to follow. I didn't say this to anyone. I sat with it and watched the last light leave the rim and thought about Pearl Acosta, 43, from Sheridan, whose car had been in that parking lot for 11 days. The search team came back down at 6:30. No Pearl Acosta, no definitive trail end. Dog team had gone cold at the plateau rim and wouldn't go further, which the handler described in a flat professional tone that suggested it wasn't the first time a dog had refused to work a specific zone. Tessler told us the search would resume in the morning with additional personnel. She said we were not required to leave, but it might be advisable. Ora said we'd make that decision in the morning. Tessler looked at our camp, looked at Everett's Bronco, and said, "Keep your lights on tonight." She drove out without elaborating. That night was different from the others. Not because of the sound didn't come. What came instead was silence of a specific quality, a silence that had something underneath it the way deep water has something underneath the surface. The fire Ora built was low and precise, and we sat around it without talking much, and the dark around the meadow had a texture to it. I'm not a superstitious man. 26 years in wildland fire will cure you of magical thinking because the fire doesn't care what you believe. But I've been in places where the land itself seems to be paying attention, where you feel observed by something too large and too old to have a name. And this was that. The plateau rim sat above us in the dark, and the rim did not move, and the night did not move, and we sat in the middle of it and waited for morning. Pearl Acosta walked into our camp at 4:40 in the morning. Not from the upper drainage, not from the direction the search team had gone. From the south, from below us, from the lower end of the meadow, from the direction of nothing. No trail, no access, just descending terrain that became increasingly rough until it dropped off into the Bighorn Basin 1,000 feet below. He came out of the dark at the meadow's south edge and walked toward the dead fire ring and sat down in one of our camp chairs and put his hands on his knees. I was awake. I was in the driver's seat, had been for 2 hours, doing the thing where you don't sleep, but you're not fully conscious either, just sitting in the dark and watching and waiting. I saw him come in. I watched him sit down. I did not immediately understand what I was seeing. I thought for a long, confused moment that it was Marcus, that Marcus had gotten up and gone outside despite everything. Then the figure turned its head slightly, and I got enough of the profile against the ambient dark to know it wasn't Marcus. I got out of the van. I know. I have thought about this choice extensively, and I would tell anyone else not to do what I did. But I got out. He was sitting in our camp chair in the middle of our camp, and I got out because the firefighter and me couldn't sit in a locked vehicle and watch something unfold without doing anything about it. I walked to the fire ring. I crouched down to where my face was level with his. His eyes were open and oriented forward, but not tracking. His skin had the specific gray quality of severe hypothermia, and his clothes were damp in the particular way of fabric that has been wet and partially dried many times. He had been outside for 11 days at October elevations. He was alive. I don't know how he was alive, and I'm not going to speculate. I went to Ora's van first, then Everett's Bronco. Within 3 minutes, all four of us were at the fire ring. Everett crouched in front of Acosta and looked at him for a long moment without touching him. Then he looked up at Ora and me and said, "Don't ask him where he was." He said it the way you say a safety instruction, not to be dramatic, just because it needed to be said before someone said the wrong thing. Marcus, to his credit, was already on his phone getting what signal he could call for emergency services. Ora had a blanket on Acosta before anyone else had moved. His hands, when she wrapped them, were the temperature of the ground. We got a fire going. I hadn't thought I'd ever need to start an emergency fire for a person at this camp, but my hands knew what to do. Acosta didn't respond to warmth the way he should have. He sat and breathed, and his eyes were open, and he didn't shiver, which is the detail that told me most clearly that his body had moved past the shivering stage, that we were in the window where people can go either direction. Marcus had a partial signal and got through to dispatch, and the life flight coordinates were confirmed by 5:15. I held a cup of warm water to Acosta's mouth, and he drank some of it. He didn't speak. Everett stayed close to him the whole time. Not physically close, he stood about 6 feet back, watching with an expression that wasn't fear and wasn't relief. something more considered than either. At one point, Acosta's head turned slowly, not in response to anything I could identify, and he looked at the upper drainage toward the plateau. Everett stepped forward immediately and put himself in Acosta's sight line, blocking it, and said something in a low voice that I couldn't hear. Acosta's head turned back. He didn't look up at the rim again. The helicopter reached us at first light, setting down at the far end of the meadow with the flat authority of emergency machinery, and the medics were professional and fast. They had Acosta on a stretcher and assessed within 4 minutes. Severe hypothermia, dehydration, some soft tissue damage on his feet consistent with extended exposure. One of the medics, moving efficiently around the stretcher, paused and looked at Acosta's right hand. He turned it over. Then he looked up at his partner, and they had one of those brief, practiced eye contacts that medical people have when they're not going to discuss something in front of civilians. I saw it. I don't know what was on the hand, and I made a decision not to ask. Before they loaded him into the helicopter, Acosta spoke. Once, clearly, in a voice that had too much space in it for a man who'd been silent for 11 days. He said, "It wanted to show me something." And then the medics moved him up and in, and the door closed, and the helicopter lifted and was gone over the rim before the sound of it had fully cleared the drainage. The 4 of us stood in the rotor wash and the early light, and the meadow went quiet again, and we stood in that quiet for a long time, looking at the chair he'd been sitting in, looking at each other, looking up at the rim. We broke camp that morning, not because anyone said it was required. Tesler called around 8 and confirmed the search was closing, that Acosta was at the hospital in Sheridan in stable condition, and that our volunteer work could continue if we chose. We chose not to. Aura filed a formal completion report noting that we'd finished 80% of the assigned trail section, which was accurate, and the org accepted it without question. Nobody asked why we'd left 2 days early. The drive down the Forest Service road felt longer than the drive up had, which is something that happens after a certain kind of night. The return journey through the same terrain carries more weight because now you know what the terrain holds. Everett led us down in the Bronco, and we followed, the 3 vehicles in a loose convoy, nobody going faster than the road required. At the bottom, where the Forest Service road met the state highway, Everett pulled over and we all got out and he shook our hands, all 3 of us, one at a time, firmly, which felt like something formalized. He said one thing before he drove north. He said that Pearl Acosta had come back, and that was the thing that mattered, and that most people who went up to the plateau under the wrong conditions did not. He said it plainly, not for effect. Then he got in the Bronco and drove, and we watched him until the road curved and he was gone. I've looked up Pearl Acosta twice since then. Once in the weeks after finding a brief item in the Sheridan Press about a man rescued after 11 days in the Bighorn backcountry, described as a hiker. Once about 4 months later, searching more specifically, I found a Facebook profile hadn't been posted on in about 3 years before October. Then a single post 2 weeks after his rescue, a photograph of a sunrise for what looks like a suburban backyard, the ordinary kind of sky you see from anywhere, with no caption. 63 people reacted to it. I was glad he was home. I thought about what he'd said. It wanted to show me something. And I thought about the 11 days and the objects on the plateau lined up like a path leading toward our camp. And I thought about Everett stepping in his sight line, so he wouldn't look at the rim again. I thought about what he might have seen up there that Everett wanted to keep him from looking for a second time. Marcus went back to Billings and, as far as I know, went back to teaching. He sent me a text in November that said only still can't hear sustained low notes without it doing something to me. Is that going to go away? I told him probably yes. I don't know if that was true. Aura took a posting in the Southwest for the rest of the season and sent me a postcard from southern Utah of all red rock and blue sky and no trees, the kind of landscape with no rims above you, nothing elevated to look down. I understood the appeal. I'm still in the van, still doing the work. I took a posting in Arizona in February, then one in southern Colorado in the spring. I've avoided the northern Rockies this season without making a policy of it. Just finding reasons to go elsewhere, just letting the work calendar fill with other places. The Bighorn Forest is still there, and the plateau is still there, and a limestone rim on a clear day catches the light the same way it always has. I'm not afraid of it. I want to be precise about that. What I have is a correct understanding of what is up there, or what uses that elevation, or what the plateau is a threshold for, and a correct understanding of my own position in relation to it, which is small and temporary, and only marginally invited. The last night at camp, after the helicopter had gone, I'd walked to the edge of the meadow and looked up at the rim one more time in the early morning light. The limestone was bright and clean and empty. Whatever had been operating up there, whatever Pearl Acosta had been shown, whatever had spent 11 days showing him, had taken itself back to wherever it came from, or was simply not visible in daylight, which are not necessarily different things. I stood there a minute, maybe two, and then I went back to my van and started packing. I did not answer the plateau. I did not look at it again. Some thresholds don't need your attention, and the best thing you can do for yourself is to understand that, pack your gear, and drive back down to the place where the road meets the highway and leads somewhere ordinary and lit and full of people who have no idea what sits above them in the high country, patient as limestone, waiting for nothing in particular. My name is Renata Ossel. I'm 41 years old, and I live in a 2004 Sportsmobile I bought off a geology professor in Fort Collins who'd used it for fieldwork for 15 years and treated it accordingly. It smelled like topographic maps and instant coffee when I got it, and it still does a little, which I've never minded. I work remotely as a technical writer for a civil engineering firm, which means I need power and intermittent internet and not much else. And the Sportsmobile handles both with a roof-mounted solar setup and a cellular booster that earns its weight about 70% of the time. My sister Claudette, 45, a pediatric nurse from Rapid City who takes 2 weeks of personal leave every fall and spends it doing something that scares her, her words, have been asking to come on a trip with me for 2 years. This was a year I said yes. She showed up in Rawlins, Wyoming, where I'd been parked for 3 days doing contract work, in a rental car she immediately hated, with a duffel bag and a portable speaker and the specific energy of a person who has been looking forward to something for a long time. I was glad to see her. I'm almost always glad to see Claudette and almost always exhausted by her within 48 hours, which is the specific dynamic of sisters. We picked up a third person in Rawlins, which was not the plan. His name was Fifer Blaine, 58, a retired cartographer from the USGS who'd been sitting in the Rawlins pilot truck stop for 2 hours with a dead rental car battery and a phone that was down to 4%. He had white hair, cut very short, a canvas field jacket with too many pockets, and the calm of a man who has been in worse situations than a dead battery and knows it. Claudette offered him a jump, and he accepted, and somewhere in the process of standing in a truck stop parking lot in October waiting for a battery to charge, we learned he was heading to the same general area we were, which was the red desert south of the Oregon Buttes, and the three of us agreed, with the easy logic of people who have nothing pressing, to caravan. The red desert is one of the least visited landscapes in Wyoming and possibly the continental United States. A high cold desert basin covering about 9,000 square miles that sits in the middle of the state and belongs to nothing in particular. No national park designation, no dramatic landmark to put on a postcard. Just space, sage and gravel and dry lake beds and buttes that rise out of the flats like they were dropped there, and a sky that doesn't end. Fifer had worked survey projects out here in the 80s and 90s and had, he said, unfinished business with a particular section of it. He said this in a way that didn't invite follow-up, and I respected that. We took Highway 789 south from Rawlins and turned off onto a BLM 2 track that Fifer navigated from what appeared to be a hand-annotated paper map. The real kind, USGS 1:24000, covered in pencil notations. He led in his rental, and I followed, and Claudette sat in the passenger seat and watched the desert open around us with the expression of someone genuinely encountering something for the first time. The Oregon Buttes appeared on the southern horizon about an hour in, 2 flat-top formations rising maybe 800 feet above the basin floor, close together, the same dark brown as everything around them. Fifer pulled off the track and stopped, and we all got out and looked. He told us, standing there in the wind with the map folded over one forearm, that the area around the Oregon Buttes was a significant landmark on the historic Oregon, California, and Mormon pioneer trails. that immigrants passing through in the 1840s and 1850s could see the buttes for 2 days before reaching them and 2 days after, that they functioned as a fixed point in an otherwise featureless basin. Navigation by landmark in terrain with no other reference. He said it with the quiet passion of a man who has spent his career thinking about how humans locate themselves in space. Claudette asked if people had died out here. He said a great many people had died out here. He said it without drama, like a fact about elevation. We camped 3 miles north of the buttes on a slight rise that gave us a 360-degree view of the basin floor. Flat in every direction, the buttes to the south, the distant rim of the basin barely visible to the north. The 2-track we coming on was the only linear feature in the landscape. Everything else was organic, random, ancient. I leveled the sports mobile and ran the power systems, and Pfeiffer set up a small tent with the efficiency of someone who has done it in every condition. Claudette built a fire in the portable ring she'd brought, which was actually thoughtful of her, and the 3 of us sat in the early dark, and the fire was the only warm thing for miles in any direction. What I noticed at dinner was how sound behaved out here. In forested mountain camps, sound is absorbed. The trees take it, the terrain breaks it. Out here in the open basin, sound traveled flat and far, and then was just gone, swallowed by the scale of the space. Our voices carried clearly, and then fell off a cliff at a certain distance. The wind was constant and low, a steady push from the southwest that you stopped hearing after a while, the way you stop hearing an engine on a long drive. Pfeiffer said the desert had its own acoustics, that sound behaved differently over flat alkaline hardpan than over any other surface, that you could sometimes hear things from distances that shouldn't be possible and miss things that were very close. Claudette asked him why he'd come back here specifically, what the unfinished business was. He looked at his plate and said, "I left something out here a long time ago. I'd like to know if it's still there." Pfeiffer was up at 5:30 before light and had walked about a quarter mile south before I saw him from the sports mobile window, a figure moving slowly across the hardpan toward the buttes, stopping every 50 feet or so, crouching, standing, moving on. I watched him for a while and then made coffee and was outside with 2 cups when he came back. He accepted one without comment. He was looking at his map, making a small pencil mark in the margin. He told me, over that coffee, more than he'd said at dinner. In 1991, he'd been part of a USGS resurvey project in this section of the Red Desert, updating datum points, verifying coordinates, the kind of unglamorous infrastructure work that makes accurate maps possible. There had been 4 of them on the crew. They'd been working the area around the Oregon Buttes for about a week when one of the crew, a young survey tech named Willis, had wandered off a work site in the late afternoon and not come back. Search and rescue had found him 2 days later about 4 miles east, alive, severely dehydrated, unable to coherently explain where he'd been or what had happened. Pfeiffer had visited Willis once in the hospital in Rock Springs. Willis had not said anything that made sense. He had died of a cardiac event 6 months later at 31 years old. I asked Pfeiffer what Willis had said in the hospital. He held his coffee cup in both hands and looked at the buttes on the south horizon. He said Willis had talked about finding something, not an object, not a person, a condition, a place where the basin's surface had a different quality, where spatial orientation stopped working the way it should, where north and south became functionally meaningless. He'd said it like a geographic feature, like a box canyon or a dry lake, but invisible, a place where you could walk a straight line and return to your starting point without turning around. Pfeiffer had spent 30-some years thinking about that. He'd come back to see if the place could be identified, to put on a map. Claudette, who'd come out during this and heard most of it, said, "And that seems like a good idea to you?" She wasn't being facetious. She genuinely wanted to understand his reasoning. Pfeiffer said he was 58 years old and had been thinking about this for 30 years, and that the alternative was not knowing, which he'd tried and didn't recommend. Claudette looked at me. I looked at my coffee. She said, "Great, we're doing this." The 3 of us walked south toward the buttes after breakfast, Pfeiffer with his map and a handheld GPS and a compass. Claudette, with her portable speaker, mercifully left at camp, me with a pack and water and a first aid kit that suddenly felt more relevant. The basin floor was harder than it looked from a distance, a crust of alkaline material over fine silt, occasionally solid, occasionally not, your boot punching through unexpectedly in a soft nothing beneath. Pfeiffer moved with the careful attention of fieldwork, checking his compass frequently, making notations. He seemed more alive out here than he had sitting in the truck stop. This was the right environment for him. We reached the base of the northern butte around 10 a.m. up close. It was more imposing. The walls were sheer in places, the rock dark and layered in bands of different geology, the top hidden from the base by its own overhang. The wind came around the butte in two conflicting directions and produced a kind of interference at the base, a low harmonic that Claudette felt before she heard it, pressing her hand to her sternum. Pfeiffer said the buttes produced that effect in certain wind conditions, that the early survey crews had documented it. He was checking his GPS against his paper map, comparing coordinates with the focused look of someone finding a discrepancy. He said something has moved. He meant a data marker, a physical survey monument, a metal rod driven into the ground that his 1991 crew had placed. By GPS, it should have been 20 meters northwest of where we were standing. He walked the 20 meters and there was no monument. He walked a grid, carefully a 10-meter radius. Nothing. He crouched and looked at the hardpan with the eye of someone who knows what disturbed ground looks like. The surface was unbroken. Either the monument had been removed, or it was somewhere else, or, and this was what I saw him considering and not saying, the coordinates were wrong in a way they shouldn't be. He spent 40 minutes on that problem while Claudette and I sat in the butte's shadow and watched. She asked me quietly if I was concerned. I said I was interested, which was true and also a deflection. She said, "There's something wrong with the sound out here." I asked what she meant. She said, "It's coming from the wrong directions. I keep thinking you're standing somewhere you're not." I looked at her. She was looking at the basin floor to the east, flat and featureless all the way to the horizon, and she had the specific expression she gets when she's decided not to catastrophize something but is working hard at it. Pfeiffer came back to us at noon looking not frightened, but revised. Like a calculation had come back with a number he hadn't expected. He said his GPS was giving him consistent readings, but that the readings didn't match his 1991 field notes. Not by a small margin, but by a meaningful one, in a direction that didn't correspond to any standard datum shift he knew of. He said he wanted to walk east for about a mile and check a second marker location. He said we should stay in sight of each other at all times. He said the last part looking at me, not Claudette, and I understood it was directed at me because he needed me to maintain the condition, to be the one who held the group together if something went sideways. I said okay. Claudette said, "If I disappear, it was nice knowing both of you." She meant it as a joke. She laughed. Neither of us laughed with her. We walked east and Claudette disappeared. Not dramatically, not one moment there and the next gone. More like the wrong, kind of gradual. We were walking in a loose triangle, Pfeiffer 5 meters ahead consulting his instruments, me in the middle, Claudette slightly behind and to my right. The basin floor was flat and the sky was clear and there was nowhere to go that wasn't visible. I was watching Pfeiffer's back when I registered, in that peripheral way, that Claudette's footsteps had stopped. I turned around. She was standing about 30 feet back, looking east with her hand raised, like she was shielding her eyes from something. I called her name. She didn't answer, not ignoring me, something different, the quality of not hearing. I went back to her and touched her arm, and she startled the way you startle from deep thought. She said she'd seen something. About 200 meters east, a shape on the hardpan, low and rectangular, like a structure. I looked east. Nothing. Flat surface, sage in clumps, the far horizon. I told her I didn't see it. She looked at me, and then back east, and then back at me, and she said it was right there, that it was obvious. How could I not see it? Pfeiffer had come back, and he looked east too, and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Describe the shape." She described it. Long and low, about the dimensions of a flatbed truck, dark-colored, with an irregular upper surface like pile material. Pfeiffer took his compass out and held it level, and the needle swung once, and then sat. He watched it for 10 seconds. It didn't oscillate the way compass needles do when they settle. It just moved and stopped hard like something had grabbed it. We walked to where Claudette had indicated. There was nothing there. No structure, no disturbed ground, no footprints but ours. Claudette stood in the spot and looked around with the expression of someone trying to locate an error. Pfeiffer walked the area in the same grid pattern he'd used at the survey monument location. Nothing. He crouched and looked at his compass again. Same behavior, sluggish, hard-stopping, inconsistent. He stood and looked at me and said, "This is the location." I said, "What location?" He said, "What Willis found." The walk back to camp took longer than the walk out. Not because we moved slowly, I set a pace and maintained it, but because the distances were wrong. The sports mobile and Pfeiffer's tent were visible from a long way out across the flat basin, which should have made navigation trivial. Straight line, fixed visual target. But the target stayed the same size for longer than it should have, the way a destination does in a dream when the corridor keeps extending. I checked my own GPS 3 times, and the distance was counting down correctly, which made the visual disagreement worse somehow. Claudette walked close to me and didn't comment on the distance anomaly, which told me she'd noticed it. We were back at camp by 2 p.m. Pfeiffer sat at the table in his tent for an hour, reviewing his field notes and GPS log side by side, making the precise, small marks of a man reconciling data. Claudette made tea on my propane burner, and we sat in the camp chairs without talking for a while, which is unusual for her in a way that I noted. She said eventually, "I still see it." She touched her temple. "When I close my eyes, I can still see the shape." She said it matter-of-factly, not panicking, just noting a symptom, like the nurse she is. I didn't sleep well that afternoon. I wasn't trying to sleep. I was lying down to think, which are different things. What I was thinking about was the geometry of it, a place where orientation fails, where the compass needle behaves like a magnet is close, where a visual impression of a structure appears to one person and not others, where the distances between visible objects and your body don't resolve correctly. I was building a model of it, the way I do with complex technical documents. What are the consistent elements? What are the variables? What does the overall structure suggest? The consistent element was interference. Something out there on the hardpan was interfering with spatial systems. Not metaphysically. Physically. I just didn't know what. Pfeiffer came out of his tent at 4 with a specific expression and sat down and told us what he'd concluded. He said the area Claudette had pointed to, the location where his compass had malfunctioned, was consistent in GPS terms with an area he'd been unable to survey correctly in 1991. An area where his instruments had behaved the same way and where Willis, the survey tech, had last been seen before his disappearance. He said there was a geological explanation that he'd been avoiding for 30 years because it was incomplete, a possible subsurface magnetic anomaly, the kind associated with deep iron formations that could explain the compass behavior and potentially produce visual effects at certain light angles. He said it explained 60% of it. He said he was no longer certain about the other 40. That night, I sat outside later than I should have and looked at the basin to the east. Clear night, no moon yet, stars and numbers that you only get at this elevation and distance from any light source. The basin floor was invisible, just a flat darkness below the star field. I tried to see the shape Claudette had described and couldn't, but I had the sustained awareness of something out there that wasn't passive. Not dangerous in an animal sense, not hostile in a human sense. Something more like a field, a condition, the thing Willis had tried to describe from a hospital bed and hadn't had the language for because there isn't a language for it, because it's never been accurately mapped. At midnight, Pfeiffer left camp and walked east. I know the time because I was awake and saw him go, watched him pick up his pack, check his GPS, and walk out into the dark basin without turning on a headlamp. I sat with that for about 90 seconds before I woke Claudette, which is less time than I'd like to admit it took me to move. She was up fast, nurse reflexes, and we were both out of the sports mobile and following him inside of 3 minutes. We could see his outline against the stars. The basin was flat enough that a standing person was a silhouette against the sky at considerable distance. He was moving steadily east, not fast, not the pace of someone in distress. More like a man walking to a known location. We called his name. He didn't respond. We closed the distance to about 30 meters and called again, and he stopped. He stood still for a moment and then turned around. He looked at us with the particular quality of someone returning from somewhere far away inside their own head. He said, "I was going to look at it." I asked him what he meant. He said he'd woken from a dream. No, not a dream. He corrected himself, something that happened while he was awake, in which the shape Claudette had described that afternoon was visible to him now, in the dark, and he'd gotten up to approach it, because in the state he was in it had seemed like the correct thing to do. He said this with the frightened precision of someone who knows their own judgment has been compromised and is trying to report it accurately anyway. His GPS was in his hand. He looked at it and then at the eastern darkness, and something crossed his face that I can only describe as longing, which on a 58-year-old cartographer in the middle of the night in the Red Desert is one of the more unsettling things I've witnessed. Claudette took his arm and turned him around, and we walked back to camp at a pace she set, and she held his arm the entire way, and he led her, which told me more about how frightened he was than anything he'd said. Back at camp, she sat him down and did a clinical assessment with the calm competence of someone who checks vitals under pressure every working day of their life. Pupils, pulse, tracking, orientation. He was physically fine. She looked at me and shook her head in a way that meant not medical, at least not in a way I can treat. I made the decision at 1 a.m. We were leaving. Not first light now. I said it once, and neither of them argued. Pfeiffer looked almost relieved, which settled something in me. Claudette started breaking down the portable fire ring. I got the sportsmobile systems sorted and running. Pfeiffer took down his tent with the same efficiency he'd put it up, but faster, hands moving with a purpose that hadn't been there before. The basin to the east was dark and flat and offered nothing visible. I didn't look at it while I worked, but while I was securing the roof equipment, I felt it. I'm going to describe it as accurately as I can. A sensation of being observed from a specific direction. East, the direction of the anomaly, the direction Pfeiffer had been walking. That was physical in quality, not emotional. Like a pressure change. Like the feeling in your ears before a storm. It lasted about 15 seconds, and then it was gone, and the night was just the night again. I have no explanation for it. It left me with the unambiguous understanding that whatever was out there had no malice and no agenda, and also no interest in whether we left or stayed, which should have been reassuring and wasn't. We were moving by 1:45. Pfeiffer's rental followed the sportsmobile north on the 2-track with the reliability of a man who needs to be moving in order to not be standing still. The track was rougher in the dark, and I drove it at a careful pace, high beams cutting 40 feet into the sage. Claudette sat in the passenger seat with her knees together and her hands in her lap and her eyes forward, and she said, "Do you think Willis knew what he'd found?" I said I thought he probably knew he'd found something that didn't have a category yet. She said, "Do you think it let him go? Or do you think he just made it back?" I didn't answer that because I didn't have an answer that was useful. We hit the highway at 250, and the contrast between the 2-track and paved road, the smoothness, the painted lines, the reflectors, was almost emotional. I pulled onto the highway and turned north and drove, and the distance between us and the Oregon Buttes increased in a measurable, reliable way, the way distances are supposed to. The GPS counted off miles that felt like miles. Claudette turned on her portable speaker very softly, a playlist she'd made for the trip, normal music, someone's voice singing about ordinary things. I didn't mind it at all. We stopped in Rawlins at 4 a.m. and sat in a 24-hour diner and drank bad coffee and ate eggs and said very little. Pfeiffer had his field notebook open on the table and was writing in it. Not frantically, deliberately, the kind of documentation you do when the experience is still fresh and you know it needs to be accurate. He wrote for about 20 minutes and then closed it and put it in his jacket pocket and ate his eggs. He said he wasn't going to publish anything. He said it clearly, as if he'd decided it on the 2-track. 30 years he'd thought about going back and putting the anomaly on a map, and now he'd been back, and he'd concluded that a map was not the right container for it. Some features, he said, are not improved by being named. He said this with the specific sadness of a cartographer deciding not to map something, which I imagine is a significant professional renunciation and wasn't said lightly. Claudette stopped seeing the shape when we reached the highway. She told me that at the diner, matter-of-factly, between bites of toast, it had been present behind her eyes continuously from the moment she'd seen it on the basin floor until the sportsmobile's wheels hit pavement, and then it was gone, like a signal losing its source. She said she found that more unsettling than if it had persisted, because it suggested the shape was location-dependent, which meant it was real in some physical sense, which meant it was something that could be found again by someone who didn't know to avoid it. We parted ways in the Rollins parking lot as the sky was going from black to gray. Pfeiffer shook our hands again. Both of us, the same formal quality as Everett's farewell, except Pfeiffer also thanked us in a way that carried more weight than the word usually does. I told him to drive carefully. He said he always had, and that it hadn't always been enough. He smiled when he said it, just barely. He drove east on I-80, and the rental car became a pair of taillights, and then nothing. Claudette and I drove west for 2 days before either of us talked about it properly. She brought it up somewhere in Utah, desert giving way to red rock, and said what she'd been sitting with. She wasn't afraid of what was out there. She was afraid of what it had done to Pfeiffer. 30 years of thinking about something you can't explain, returning to it, almost walking into the dark toward it at midnight like a man answering a summons he couldn't argue with. She said, "I don't want to still be thinking about this in 30 years. I told her I understood. I told her the trick was probably not to try to explain it, to let it be a thing that happened and not a problem that requires a solution. I don't know if I believe that. I'm a technical writer by trade. My entire professional function is to make complex things clear and accessible. The Red Desert Anomaly is not that. It's a condition, as Willis called it from his hospital bed. A feature of a specific stretch of alkaline hardpan in a 9,000 square mile basin that most people will never visit, that doesn't appear on any map because the only cartographer who knew where it was decided it shouldn't. Pfeiffer had come back to measure it and left having decided it was beyond measurement. I find that simultaneously maddening and correct. The Sportsmobile is running fine. I'm in New Mexico right now, outside of Taos, on a mesa with a long view west and the Rio Grande Gorge visible at the mesa's edge, and absolutely nothing about the terrain that interferes with spatial orientation. My GPS works. Distances behave correctly. When I close my eyes, I see nothing but the inside of my eyelids, which is the correct and appropriate result. Claudette texted me last week a photo of a sunrise from her backyard in Rapid City. No caption, which is the way she communicates that she's okay. I texted back a thumbs up, which is the way I communicate the same. We haven't talked about the Red Desert since Utah, and I think that's right for now. But I'll say this, I pulled up a satellite view of the area south of the Oregon Buttes last month, late at night, out of the particular weakness I have for trying to understand things. I was looking at the basin floor east of where we'd camped, the section where Claudette had seen the shape, where Pfeiffer's compass had failed, where Willis had been lost for 2 days in 1991. Flat terrain, uniform surface, nothing distinctive. And then I noticed that directly over that section, the satellite imagery had a faint, irregular discoloration. Not dramatic, just a slight variation in the surface tone, roughly the dimensions Claudette had described. The shape of a flatbed truck. Long, low, rectangular. I closed the laptop. I haven't opened it since. My name is Dex Calloway. I'm 38 years old, and I've been living out of a 2011 Ram ProMaster for about 14 months. Ever since the restaurant I'd spent 8 years building in Bozeman went under in a way that was slow enough to be humiliating and fast enough to be shocking. I was a chef before I was a van person. I still cook well, which is probably the most useful thing about me at this point, and the van has a 2-burner setup that I've made produce things that would embarrass most kitchens, which is a small satisfaction I allow myself. My situation on this particular trip was specific. I was transiting through Wyoming eastbound, heading toward a catering consultation in Omaha that was going to take 2 weeks and pay enough to cover 3 months of van expenses. I had 4 days to make a drive I could do in 2, so I was taking the long way, south through the basin country, through terrain I'd never driven, the way you do when time is the one thing you actually have. I was alone for the first 2 days, which suited me fine. I am comfortable with my own company in a way that took me a long time and a failed marriage and a failed business to achieve. I met Taryn Shull at a fuel stop in Lander. She was 29, a graduate student in environmental policy from the University of Wyoming, driving a converted Subaru Outback that she'd fitted with a sleeping platform in the back and absolutely nothing else. No insulation, no real ventilation, no cooking setup. She was making a 4-day weekend trip to photograph sage grouse habitat for a research project and had, by her own admission, underestimated how cold October nights in Wyoming were going to be. She asked if I had a spare sleeping bag. I had 2. We traveled together from Lander south because her research area and my route overlapped for about 60 miles, and the Outback had a noise from the front left. Well, she wasn't sure about that. She wanted company in case it materialized into a problem. The noise turned out to be a loose dust shield, which I fixed with a zip tie in a pullout south of Lander, and by the time I'd done that, we'd talked enough that Taryn had decided to follow me for the rest of the day and find a camp together, which was fine by me. She was sharp and direct and talked about sage grouse habitat with the specific passion of someone who has chosen a subject that other people find boring and decided that's their problem. I like that. I made her dinner that first evening, an actual meal, roasted vegetables and white beans and leftover flatbread, and she looked at it like someone had handed her a gift, which, given what she'd been eating from a cooler full of granola bars, I suppose it was. The location I'd identified for the second night was a stretch of BLM land east of South Pass City, a near ghost town in Fremont County that sits at the south end of the Wind River Range where the mountains flatten into the high prairie. South Pass itself, the broad, gentle divide that made the Oregon Trail possible, the lowest crossing of the Continental Divide along the whole route, is right there. Historically significant in a way that's out of proportion with how unimpressive the terrain looks. No dramatic gap in the mountains, just a long, gentle slope that levels into a wide, high saddle and keeps going. Immigrants crossed it and weren't sure they had until they checked which way the water ran. The BLM 2 track I turned off on went east from the highway for about 2 miles before ending at a flat area with an old fire ring and a view north toward the Wind Rivers that was genuinely something. The range rising white-capped above the brown prairie, the late afternoon light hitting the peaks, while everything below was already in shadow. Taryn was out of the Outback before the dust had settled, camera in hand. I started cooking. The wind was steady and cold but not mean, and the silence out there had the quality of the high prairie. Empty in a way that's about space, not absence. Well, I noticed before dark, doing a slow walk around the area the way I always do when I arrive somewhere new, was the fence. Standard Wyoming ranch fence. 3 strands of barbed wire on weathered posts, running east to west about 150 yards north of where we'd parked. Posted at intervals with orange, no trespassing signs. The BLM-style ones with black text. Nothing unusual about that. The BLM land, we were on abutted private ranch land constantly out here, and the fencing was normal. What was slightly less normal was a second fence line I found running north to south, intersecting the first, enclosing a rough rectangle of land to the northeast. Double posted at the corner junction with 3 signs instead of 1, and below the standard no trespassing signage, a handwritten addition on a piece of weathered board wired to the post. It said, "Stay out. This means you," which is a thing ranchers write sometimes, I know. Private property frustration is legitimate and common. But the handwriting had a quality, and I stood there and looked at it long enough to register this. That wasn't angry. It was careful, like someone had taken time with it. Like it was less a warning to trespassers and more a warning to someone specific who they expected to come. Taryn saw the sign when I mentioned it at dinner and wanted to go look, which I should have expected, because she's the kind of person who moves toward things rather than away from them. I told her we'd look in the morning, in daylight, and she accepted that, which tells you something about how good the food was. We ate and talked about South Pass, which she knew more about than I did. The specific history of it, the immigrant journals, the particular cruelty of getting that far across the continent and still having most of the worst terrain ahead of you. She said something that stayed with me. That South Pass worked as a route not because it was easy, but because it was legible. You could read it. You could understand where you were in relation to where you were going. She said most of the places people died on the trail were places where the land stopped being legible. I slept well, which in retrospect seems wrong, but at the time the camp felt settled and ordinary. I woke at 6 to a sky that was doing something extraordinary. A hard, clear, cold dawn with a Chinook pushing in from the northwest that had already raised the temperature 15 degrees from the night's low and was bending the sage flat. Taryn was already up, working the light with her camera along the fence line to the north. I made coffee and watched her and thought that there were worse ways to start morning. We walked to the double-fenced rectangle together after breakfast. In daylight, it was more defined. The enclosure was roughly 2 acres, maybe 100 by 200 yards, the grass inside it visibly different from the prairie outside. Longer, unmanaged, a brighter green that suggested better water access below the surface. Within the enclosure, visible from the fence line, there were 2 structures. The first was the foundation and partial standing walls of what had been a small building. Homestead-era stonework, roofless, the interior filled with years of debris and volunteer vegetation. The second was more recent, a metal equipment shed, green painted, maybe 30 by 40 feet, padlocked, no windows, in good condition relative to everything around it. A solar panel array on the roof, which was functioning. The panels were clean and correctly oriented. Taryn photographed everything from outside the fence. She asked who owned the land. I said I didn't know, but that the solar panel suggested someone was actively maintaining it, which meant the property was in current use, which meant we should not go inside the fence, which she agreed with in the tone of someone agreeing to a condition they intend to renegotiate later. I walked the perimeter. The fence was solid and well-maintained. Recent stapling on the wire, sound posts, no gaps. At the south face of the enclosure, the handwritten sign was repeated, same board, same careful lettering. Stay out. This means you. I looked up South Pass City land records on my phone, which had decent signal out here surprisingly. The parcel showed as private, owned by an LLC registered in Casper called Halloran Basin Holdings, which told me nothing useful. Taryn suggested it might be a mining claim. There's a lot of old gold mining activity in this stretch of the Wind River Range foothills, most of it dating to the 1860s and 70s. The equipment shed and solar setup could be consistent with an active small-scale mining operation, or with monitoring equipment, or with any number of legitimate uses that explain the signage and explain nothing else. What happened at noon was this. A truck appeared on the 2-track from the highway. A white F-350, moving at a pace that wasn't urgent but wasn't casual. It pulled into our camping area and stopped about 30 feet from the ProMaster, and a man got out. He was around 60, tall, lean, wearing a canvas work jacket and a cap, and the expression of someone who had been thinking about what he was going to say on the drive-in. He introduced himself as Kurt Halloran. He said he owned the property to the north and that he'd seen our vehicles on the camera he had on the fence line. I said we were on BLM land. He agreed, without objection, and said that was fine. He then said he wanted to ask us to move our camp to the other side of the highway, about a mile west, where there was another BLM pullout. I asked why, since we were on public land. He was quiet for a moment and then said, because what I've got going on over there is better looked at from a distance. He said it looking at the enclosure to the north. I asked what he had going on. He looked at me for a moment, assessing, I think, and said, research. He said it with a period after it, not an invitation. He gave us 30 minutes to relocate, which he delivered not as a threat, but as a fact, shook my hand, got in his truck, and drove back out. Taryn and I looked at each other. She said, research. I said, yeah. She looked at the enclosure. I looked at the truck on the highway, turning north, shrinking. The solar panels on the shed roof caught the afternoon light. I thought about the handwritten sign, not angry, careful, and about what it would take to make a man drive out here, specifically to relocate 2 campers on public land 150 yards from his fence. What was in that shed that required that degree of management? We moved camp to the western pullout as instructed, because I was raised to respect reasonable requests even when I didn't understand them, and because something about Kurt Halloran's tone had not been unreasonable. It had been the tone of a man managing a situation that was more complicated than he was explaining. We set up again in the new spot, and Taryn was quieter than she'd been all day, and at dinner she said, "I want to go look at that shed." I told her no. She said she was going to go look at it regardless, and that I could either come with her or sit here and worry. I thought about that for a while. I went with her. We crossed the fence at the southwest corner at 9 p.m., where I'd found the best ground clearance under the bottom wire, enough to slide under without catching. Taryn went first, and I followed, and we moved through the long grass toward the equipment shed using the ruined homestead walls as a waypoint and keeping low out of habit. The night was clear, the Chinook still running warm, and the stars above the wind rivers to the north were dense enough to navigate by. The shed was solid and plain up close. Standard agricultural metal construction, corrugated green steel, a heavy padlock on the sliding front door that wasn't going anywhere without a key. Taryn moved around the perimeter slowly. I watched the fence line and the 2-track for lights. There were no windows in the walls, but at the roof line, there was a ventilation gap running the full length of the east wall, a 4-inch clearance between the wall panels and the roof edge. Insufficient to see through, but sufficient to hear through, and what I heard, standing with my ear near that gap, was mechanical. A low-frequency hum with a regular interval that could have been a generator, except it was too consistent, too clean. More like a pump, or multiple pumps running in coordination. Taryn had gone around to the north face, and I followed, and she pointed. At the north end of the shed, where the ground met the foundation, there was a pipe. Black, 4-inch diameter, going into the ground at an angle, with a secondary coupling and a valve handle. The pipe was sweating, condensation on cold metal, which meant whatever was going through it was significantly colder than the ambient temperature. At this time of year, in Wyoming, that required either considerable depth or active refrigeration. She photographed it, crouching close, the camera flash off, using her phone light briefly. I want to be precise about what happened next, because I've replayed it many times. We were both crouched to the north face of the shed when the lights inside, which we hadn't known were on because there were no windows, went off. I know they'd been on because the ventilation gap had been emitting a faint light bleed at the roof line that I hadn't consciously registered until it was gone. When it went dark, the sound changed too. Not stopped, modulated. Like whatever system was running had shifted into a different mode. And then from inside the shed, through the ventilation gap, clearly and without ambiguity, came a sound I am not going to characterize as anything other than what it was, a human voice. Not words, a sustained vocalization, low and repetitive, that had the quality of someone who has been doing the same thing for a very long time. We did not run. Running would have made noise on the dry grass, and I didn't want to make noise. We moved low and fast back toward the southwest corner, back through the fence, back across the 150 yards to the ProMaster in a silence that was less about discipline and more about neither of us having anything useful to say yet. Inside the van, Taryn sat with her knees pulled up, and I locked the doors, and we stayed quiet for a while. She said finally, "That was a person." I said I knew. She said, "In the shed." I said I knew. She said the pump sound, the cold pipe. "Dex, what was that?" I didn't have an answer that I was willing to say out loud. What I had was a collection of details that assembled themselves into a picture I didn't want to look at directly. A padlocked shed on a private parcel with active power, a refrigerated pipe going underground, a voice inside that wasn't doing anything voluntary voices do, and a property owner who had driven out specifically to move us away. Not aggressive, not legally threatening, just managed. The way you manage a situation where discovery is the main risk. I called the Fremont County Sheriff's Office at 10:15 p.m. I described what we'd found and heard. The dispatcher was thorough and professional and asked me to stay on the line while she reached a deputy. The deputy I spoke to was named Packer, and he asked me several questions in the careful sequence of someone building a report. Location, description of the structure, exact nature of what we'd heard. He asked if we were currently on the private property. I said no. We were at the BLM pull-out a mile west. He said a unit would respond and asked us to stay where we were. Taryn was looking at her photographs on her phone while I was on the call, scrolling through what she'd taken at the shed. She stopped on one and held the screen toward me. It was the photo of the pipe junction, the one she'd taken in the brief flash of her phone light. In the background of the image, past the pipe and a shed wall. The phone light had caught the ground at an angle that revealed the earth there differently. A depression in the soil, rectangular, running parallel to the shed's north wall. The dimensions of something that had been dug and filled, or something that was being kept. I looked at it for a long time. Then I looked at Taryn. She said, "There's more than one." I looked at the photo again. She was right. 2 depressions, side by side, just visible at the image edge. The deputies unit arrived at our pullout at 11:40 p.m. 2 vehicles, Deputy Packer and a second deputy named Rowe. They were efficient and serious, and Packer looked at Taryn's photographs for a long time, without speaking. He made a call from his vehicle. When he came back, he told us that additional units were being dispatched, and that a warrant was being sought. He told us to stay exactly where we were, gave us his direct number, and drove north with Rowe toward the property. We sat in the ProMaster and watched the darkness to the north. No lights, no sound. The wind was still running warm from the northwest, and the sage was moving in long waves, and the only thing visible in the direction of the property was the dark sky above the wind rivers. Taryn had her phone out and was writing notes, dates, times, descriptions, with the focused efficiency of someone who understands documentation. I made coffee, mostly for the activity of it, and sat in the driver's seat and watched the 2-track. At 12:20 a.m. lights appeared to the north. Multiple vehicles moving on the highway, turning onto the 2-track. A serious response. I counted headlights from 3, maybe 4 units. Taryn watched beside me. The vehicles disappeared behind the rise between us and the property, and for a while, there was nothing but the ambient glow of headlights against low clouds. Then radio traffic from Packer's number. A brief call. "Stay where you are. We have the scene. You're safe," which answered one question and implied several others. What I will tell you about the next 2 hours is limited. Partly because we weren't there, partly because what Deputy Packer told us afterward was limited by what he could share from an active investigation. What I can tell you is this. At 1:15 a.m., 2 ambulances went past our pullout heading north. At 1:50 they came back south, moving fast. At 2:30 Packer came to the ProMaster and sat in the passenger seat and told us, carefully, that they had found 2 individuals on the property who were alive and receiving medical attention, and that the scene was being processed as a crime scene. He said there would be investigators from the state DCI, Division of Criminal Investigation, arriving in the morning, and that we would need to remain available for statements. He said one other thing before he got out. He said, the sign on the fence. He meant the handwritten edition, "Stay out. This means you." He said investigators believed it was written by one of the individuals found on the property, not by the property owner. He said it in the way that information lands when it reconfigures everything you thought you understood about a situation. I sat with that. Someone inside that fence, inside that shed, had written that sign, had found a way to attach it to the fence post facing out, had written it carefully, legibly, because it was the one communication they could make to anyone who came close enough to read it. Not a threat, a plea. "Stay out. This means you." Taryn got out of the ProMaster and walked to the edge of the pullout and stood there in the dark for a while. I let her. When she came back, she had been crying, which she dealt with by getting in and pulling her knees to her chest and looking at the wall of the van with the specific expression of someone reprocessing a sequence of events and arriving at a different understanding of each one. The sun, the phone camera bleed on the shed interior, the pipe cold and sweating, the voice in the ventilation gap, the rectangular depressions in the ground, each one landing differently now. I didn't sleep. I sat in the driver's seat until 5 a.m. and watched the glow of lights to the north and listened to the occasional distant sound of vehicles on the 2-track and thought about Kurt Halloran driving out here at noon to relocate 2 campers with the calm, managed efficiency of someone who had thought through contingencies, who had factored in the possibility of witnesses and had a response prepared, who had looked at me when he said research and made the calculation that I would accept that and move on. He'd been right. I had. For about 9 hours I had accepted it and moved on and made dinner and gone to bed. And if Taryn hadn't been the kind of person who moves toward things instead of away from them, we would have broken camp in the morning and driven to Omaha and never known what was in that shed 150 yards from where I'd slept. The DCI investigators arrived at 7 a.m. and we gave statements for 2 hours in a canvas-sided field command unit they set up at the pullout. Professional, thorough, patient with everything we could tell them, and careful not to tell us anything in return, which was appropriate. The lead investigator was a woman named Sable Morse who listened to everything twice and asked follow-up questions that told me she'd already formed a good picture of the sequence of events and was verifying details. She looked at Taryn's photographs for a long time, particularly the one with the rectangular depressions. We were released by 9:30. Packer shook our hands at the vehicles, a firm, genuine handshake, the kind that means something happened here and we both know it, and told us we might be contacted for follow-up. He said we'd done the right thing. Taryn said she'd done the illegal thing, technically crossing that fence, and he said sometimes those overlap. He said it straight, not smiling, and turned back toward the property. I drove Taryn back to Lander that morning because her research area was north and her outback was going to need more than a zip tie if she was going to feel confident in it. And because she was quiet in a way that I recognized as the post-adrenaline settling that follows a night like that, and that shouldn't be processed alone in a subcompact on a two-lane highway. We didn't talk much. She looked at the wind rivers as we drove north, white and enormous above the Brown Basin. And I thought about South Pass just south of us. The legible landscape, the crossing you could read, the divide you understood by watching which way the water ran. I thought about the two people in that shed. I thought about the sign on the fence and the care of the handwriting, and how long a person has to be somewhere before they get one opportunity to communicate and decide to use it on a warning to strangers. The investigation became public about 3 weeks later. Enough that I saw it referenced in a Wyoming news aggregate I check occasionally. A brief item about an arrest in Fremont County related to unlawful imprisonment. Kurt Halloran's name was in it. The address matched the parcel. The item said 2 victims had been recovered. It said they were receiving care. It didn't say much else, and I didn't dig for more, because I decided there was a version of following this story that was about satisfying my own need for a complete narrative, and that wasn't mine to have. The people who had been in that shed were entitled to whatever privacy the aftermath gave them. Taryn emailed me in November, a long one, the kind you write when you've been thinking about something for weeks and need to finally put it somewhere. She said she'd been back to her campus counselor. She said her sage-grouse habitat research had been submitted and accepted. She said she kept thinking about the sign, about the decision someone made to write it carefully, to make it legible, to put it where a stranger might see it and might understand. She said they were trying to save us, and we ended up saving them, which is a weird loop I keep turning over. I wrote back and said I was turning it over too, and that I thought the point where those two things crossed, their attempt to warn us, our stumbling into their warning, was South Pass logic. The legible landscape. The crossing you find not because it's dramatic, but because the terrain makes it possible if you pay attention. The ProMaster is running fine. I made it to Omaha, completed the catering consultation, drove back western Nebraska and Wyoming in November with the heat running most of the way. I've parked in a lot of places since the South Pass pullout. Rest stops, BLM land, truck stops, state parks, and I've kept the habit I'd always had of walking the area when I arrive, checking the perimeter, reading the land. I look at signs more carefully now, not just the official ones, the handmade ones, the ones that required effort, the ones where someone took time with the letters. Out here, people put signs on fences for real reasons, and most of them are exactly what they appear to be, and a few of them are the only message someone could send. I think about that every time I pull off a highway onto a 2-track and kill the engine and sit in the new quiet, a new place, and decide what I'm going to do next. The Red Desert, the Bighorn Basin, the High Prairie at South Pass. Wyoming has a way of putting you in landscapes that require you to read them correctly, where being wrong about what you're looking at has consequences. I've gotten better at reading. I don't think I'll ever stop paying attention to the fences.